Board Member Hanson. Board Member Hart.
Here.
Chair Huntsman.
Present.
Board Member Hymas.
He will be coming. He just got held up for a minute.
Okay, Board Member Lear.
Here.
Board Member Moss. I thought I saw him. Board Member Moss. Board Member Norton.
Here.
And Board Member Straight.
Yo.
Thank you. As authorized by Utah Code 52-4, this meeting is being held electronically without an anchor location, as the location where the public body would normally meet is closed to the public for safety reasons. So we will go ahead and jump right into the content of today. And we have Ben Rasmussen, our Director of Law and Professional Practices, and he's going to be discussing Utah Professional Practices Advisory Commission, which is our UPAC overview. And Ben, we are looking forward to learning from you. And if you have time for us to throw in a few questions, that would be great too. But we have a hard stop at 3 p.m. And if you end a bit sooner, then we'll get started on our next topic a little sooner.
All right, sounds good. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today, board members. As Vice Chair Davis indicated, my name is Ben Rasmussen, and I am the Director of Law and Professional Practices for the State Board. The presentation we have for you today, it's anticipated that we're going to do in two parts. The first part will be me giving you a high-level overview of how the UPAC investigation process works, what UPAC looks like, and how a case goes through our chain of our process. At the end of my presentation, we anticipate taking questions after I go through my slides. Then the second part of the presentation will be from Assistant Attorney General Michelle Buse. She will talk to you a little bit about board review of UPAC cases and what kind of standards and rules are involved for that process. And at the end of her presentation, we have another point for board members to ask questions. So it's anticipated that you'll hold questions until the appropriate spot in the presentation. Without further ado, we'll get to it. So the UPAC is authorized by statute, and that's where that comes from. UPAC is the different duties and responsibilities of UPAC are all elaborated in statute. The primary things that UPAC does are investigate educator misconduct, conduct hearing on licensing matters when there are disputes as to what the outcome of cases should be, and then to make recommendations to the state board about what should happen in UPAC cases and also what UPAC rules should look like. One thing kind of interesting about the UPAC statute that you may be interested to know is that right now UPAC is slated to sunset in July of 2023, I believe it is, or in 2023. It's anticipated the legislature will review UPAC and how it works before that comes about. And then there will be UPAC action. There will be action by the legislature on how UPAC works. UPAC is composed in a specific way by statute. UPAC is required to have 9 licensed educators. 6 of those are required to be classroom teachers, and 3 of them are required to hold other licensed positions. So you can see in our membership, we have classroom teachers from Ogden, Davis, JUAB, Salt Lake Murray, and a charter school. And we have administrators from Logan, Granite, and Provo right now. We also have 2 community representatives on the commission that are nominated generally by the PTA, and that's prescribed by statute as well. As the executive secretary appointed by the superintendent, I'm a non-voting member of UPAC, meaning I can consult with them, but other than that, I don't get a vote in the recommendations that they make to this board. Now, UPAC's process and how our hearings work could take several hours probably of study sessions for the board, but I will draw your attention to something if you ever want to see how specific hearings work and all the nitty-gritty details about our process. We've put together a lot of guides to help educators understand that. They're available on our UPAC section page on the board's website. And if you ever want to see how UPAC works or how a background check works, you can get all the details there in those guides that we have available to the public. Now I want to talk to you about how a case starts and how kind of what the case process looks like after a case starts. But when we get a case for UPAC, it's referred to us in most cases by the LEA where the educator works. We get a referral from the LEA or Charter School Human Resources after they've investigated the matter, and we take it from there. We also have a form available on our website for members of the community to make referrals to UPAC. And we do get a number of those where a parent or someone else in the community is concerned with something that a teacher is doing or an educator is doing, and then they will refer that to UPAC. And another source for UPAC cases frequently comes from the internal audit hotline. If they receive hotline complaints that deal with licensed educators, they forward those to us and we treat them as a new case and make a determination whether to look into it. The other source of UPAC cases sometimes will be news reports. If we see something in the news, we can follow up on that even if we don't get the referral from an LEA. The rules for UPAC have standards that UPAC is to follow in determining whether to open a case. These are new to us just in the last year, and it's been good to have this guidance as to the things that we should look for when opening a case. The rules say that UPAC shall open a case most readily when there's an allegation involving physical or emotional safety of a student, an allegation with a highly visible impact on the LEA or the community, when there's potential damage to the integrity of the profession, when the educator's LEA recommends that UPAC conduct an investigation, or when the educator has had prior UPAC discipline. Those are kind of the big issues that we're looking for. And of course, we're looking for things obviously that violate the enumerated standards in our educator standards rule. When UPAC reviews a case to start out with, they can vote to take no action if they don't think it merits an investigation. They can recommend that we conduct an expedited hearing, which is kind of a short hearing that we'll talk about, and is meant to be an abbreviated way to handle a case. Or we can open a full investigation, assign an investigator, and go through the full process. We do an expedited hearing when there is a situation where the material evidence in the case does not appear to be in dispute. The educator agrees with that they have done something wrong, and the LEA has resolved it quickly with the educator. And it also is for cases where we expect that the outcome of the case will be something of a lower level, like a letter of education or a letter of warning. Not anything that would result in a flag on cactus or a suspension. At an expedited hearing, we don't flag the educator's license right off the bat like we normally do for an investigation. We conduct an informal hearing. Since the pandemic started, we've been conducting these over Zoom or over a web platform, and I think that's something that we'll continue doing going forward for these hearings. We have a 3-person panel from UPAC. I act as the hearing officer and run the hearing. And these are usually hearings that we get done in half an hour to an hour, where we can either recommend to the board that we close the case with training, issue a letter of education or warning, or open a full investigation if we think it requires more investigation after we hear from the parties involved. We hear from the educator that's involved, and we also invite someone from the LEA to participate in case we need their perspective on any issues. And then these are cases that end up on the board's UPAC consent calendar for final resolution after UPAC reviews the findings of the hearing. We also have many cases where we are required to investigate the case. An investigation by UPAC takes usually 6 to 12 months. A UPAC attorney is going to review the LEA's evidence and meets with witnesses, gathers new evidence, much like a detective would in a criminal case. Our attorneys take on that role, and then they prepare an investigative report, which they present at our monthly UPAC meeting. UPAC at the monthly meeting will review the case and makes a recommendation to the board. The educator during this investigatory process can either accept the UPAC recommendation and sign a consent to discipline, or they can request a full hearing if they don't think the recommendation is just. So how does UPAC come up with these recommendations? They don't just come out of thin air. There's a couple of things primarily that we're looking at. First and foremost, we have an administrative rule that governs the UPAC presumptions. That's R277-215. You can see there's kind of a spectrum that you probably recognize most of those names of actions from our UPAC cases that we've done in executive session. But the low end is a letter of education, which is a case where we say, we don't think there's been anything necessarily wrong here, but you might want to watch it because you've gotten close to the line. A letter of warning is our lowest level of discipline for a case where we feel the standards have been violated. Just says, you know, we think there's been some error here, but no further action will be taken. We're just giving you a warning. With a reprimand, we take that and we add a flag on the cactus file that goes 2 years from the date that it was referred to UPAC. Suspension, obviously, they lose their license for a period of time. An educator under suspension can't teach, work, consult, or volunteer in a Utah public school classroom during the period of their suspension, and they have to complete other terms before they can have a hearing and have their license reinstated. Finally, the ultimate and most serious action that we can take against a license is revocation, where an educator's license is permanently revoked. One other thing we look at in determining what to recommend to the board is our discipline matrix. This is something that came into play as a result of a prior lawsuit with the Utah Education Association, but it's been a very good add to our UPAC system. We keep track of the different cases that have come through UPAC and have a spreadsheet that's available to the public online. You can see the facts of what's happened in each UPAC case that resulted in action. And basically, when we are trying to decide what to do in a case, we can look to that matrix and try and be consistent with how we've handled similar cases. That's not always easy because all these cases are very unique and we have to be decided on their own circumstances. But when there are cases that are similar or identical, we try and be consistent for the sake of fairness. If the educator doesn't like the UPAC recommendation, we conduct a hearing. And this is something where an educator can request a hearing if they're receiving a reprimand, a suspension, or a revocation. They cannot request a hearing for a warning or something less. Like the expedited hearing, a UPAC hearing has a 3-member panel. A hearing usually takes 1 to 2 days. We take witnesses and evidence, just like you'd see in a courtroom. And the UPAC, in order to substantiate licensing action against an educator, must prove its case by a preponderance of the evidence. So more likely than not that the educator committed the misconduct or they aren't responsible for any licensing action. After a UPAC hearing, the hearing officer prepares a report working with the panel. The hearing officer can collaborate with the panel, but the panel is the one that decides what to recommend to UPAC and ultimately to the board. And then UPAC reviews the panel's recommendations before sending it to the board for approval. From time to time, you'll see an executive secretary's addendum at the end of that hearing report. That means that UPAC's reviewed the hearing report and wants to add something or wants to change some component of that hearing report. And you'll see one of those in our next hearing report that's coming to the board next week. Finally, UPAC, there are a few different things that UPAC can forward to the board after a UPAC case. So there are some cases where an educator sees the writing on the wall and doesn't want to go through the investigation processes, and they will submit a surrender petition to the board. With a surrender petition, they just ask the board for approval for them to give up their educator license, and that's permanent. You may see a default order. This is a case where the educator doesn't respond to UPAC's attempts to contact them about a case. And so UPAC will find them in default. The board will all find them in default, and we make a recommendation to the board to take action because they've chosen not to participate. A consent to discipline is what we send to the board when an educator has gone through the UPAC process and accepts UPAC's recommendation. And finally, a hearing report, as I've said, is what we produce after we've conducted a hearing on discipline, where a hearing officer will prepare that report for UPAC and the board to consider what the ultimate outcome should be. And so that's kind of what happens in the UPAC process. So that's a high-level overview of things, pretty quick, I understand, but we just wanted to give you a basic overview of how UPAC works before we turn to Michelle's part about how the board reviews UPAC cases. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have about UPAC and how it works at this stage. Is it that easy?
I don't see any
Yeah.
hands, Ben. Great job.
Looks like we do have one from member Klein.
Oh, did one pop up?
Yeah, that's me. I just had a quick question. You mentioned the enumerated standards rule. What is that?
So we have an educator standards rule. That's rule R277 217. That states the different things that educators are prohibited from doing as educators, and also the things that they must do as educators. So there's 2 sections. And so if we're going to take licensing action against an educator, it's because they violated our educator standards that are set forth in that rule.
Okay, so it's the standards that the board sets as far as education standards, but the professional standards.
Correct. And following other board rules would be one of those standards, is that they need to comply with the law. They need to comply with board rule. So if an educator were not following the board standards and something else, that would implicate the educator standards as well.
I don't see any other hands. Unless
Okay.
sees one I'm missing. Ben, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate your presentation.
Okay, Michelle Buse has the rest.
Okay, and I'm going to also present to you a high-level overview of how we hope that the decisions that you make will be legally defensible decisions. So with that in mind, the Utah Legislature recognizes education as a profession and has declared that those who are licensed or seek to become licensed and to serve as educators in Utah shall, number one, meet high standards, both as to qualifications and fitness for service, and also maintain those standards in the performance of their duties while holding these licenses. Next slide. An individual desiring to obtain an educator license has the burden of proving that he or she has met the standards set by state law and board rule, and that they are deserving of being awarded that license. Next slide. Once an individual has met the requirements to get their educator license, if they are alleged to have violated the professional standards of conduct, the board has the burden of proving that an adverse action against their license is appropriate. Next slide. The United States Supreme Court has recognized that an individual who has met the requirements of and has obtained a professional license, such as an educator license, has an individual property interest in that license. And you, as a government actor, cannot take a negative action impacting a person's property interest without providing the individual with due process. Next slide. Taking action against an educator's license requires that the board comply with the constitutional standards of both procedural due process and substantive due process. In terms of procedural due process, the amount of process that is due to an individual varies greatly depending on the nature of the property right that's being placed at risk. For example, a public school student facing a possible suspension from school for less than 10 days is subject to what is considered a temporary administrative penalty. Notice and an opportunity to be heard in these instances are satisfied by an informal verbal exchange, simply meeting with an administrator who informs the student of the allegation. For example, Sally said you hit her when she said you told her not to butt in line. The administrator then allows the student to verbally respond to the allegation. This is considered sufficient notice and opportunity to be heard for an offense that results in a minimally impactful consequence. On the other end of the spectrum, an individual charged with a serious crime and facing possible loss of personal liberty through incarceration is provided with extensive procedures regarding notification of the charges and a very formal opportunity to access and respond to the evidence, present his own evidence, and have a say in who will hear the evidence. Procedural due process for you to take action against an individual's interest in holding an educator's license falls somewhere in between these two examples. Next slide. Due process in this instance is defined by Utah Code. Utah Code defines notice as at least 15 days prior to a hearing, the educator must be provided with notice of the hearing itself, the allegations against them, sufficient information about the allegations and the evidence that is going to be presented in support of the allegations so that it allows the individual to prepare a meaningful defense, and a copy of the policies or procedures under which the hearing will be conducted. The individual's opportunity to be heard in this instance requires that the hearing address specified, definite issues of fact or law, and that the educator is provided the right to appear with or without counsel. They are allowed to present evidence, to confront and cross-examine witnesses, and to have witnesses subpoenaed on their behalf. These requirements are satisfied if a party has been given a reasonable opportunity to be heard, even if the party fails to attend a hearing or chooses not to request a hearing. Next slide. In addition to those procedural due process elements, government action affecting a property interest has to meet the substantive standard of due process, which is the action that you choose to take may not be arbitrary or capricious. This means the consequence must have a rational basis and not be so arbitrary or capricious as to shock the conscience of the court. The decision ultimately must be based on facts supported by the evidence. Next slide. So in summary, due process for an action that you will take requires that the educator be provided procedural due process, meaning notice and an opportunity to be heard, and substantive due process, meaning that the decision is based solely on the evidence and the administration of appropriate sanctions where the allegations are substantiated. Next slide. In addition to that statutory due process that you're required to provide and constitutional due process that you're required to provide, you as a board have made many rules that help through this process. The board has adopted administrative rules that guide not just UPAC, but they guide the hearing officers when there are hearings, they guide the educator in knowing what their rights are, and they guide you as a board as to what your options are when it comes before you. Next slide. As Ben described, recommendations will come to you in these four formats: a voluntary surrender, a default, a consent to discipline, or a formal hearing recommendation. You need to know that your rules provide very specific options available to you in considering each of these recommendations. First, let's look at a voluntary surrender and a default. When those two come to you, we'll look at the different options that you have under your rules to be able to do. Both of these will come to you with a recommendation that contains a summary of the allegations, the evidence that was available to the investigator, and the applicable presumptions that are in the rules. A petition to surrender or voluntary surrender will come to you when an educator voluntarily waives their right to due process and they permanently surrender the license. The only option to you is to approve it. The board can't really force a person to participate in a hearing or to fight for their license. And although the educator surrenders their license, your approval is necessary as a final administrative action. After that happens, the executive secretary will provide notification to the educator, to the employer if there still was one, and officially record the outcome in Cactus and NASDAQ. Your rules do, however, provide that you may direct UPAC to continue to investigate the matter. I have not seen this option taken by the board. It would involve allocation of the limited resources of UPAC towards a person who has already conceded not to practice as an educator. So I don't see that happening in the future. In a default, the educator has failed to respond to the allegations and failed to assert the rights available to them. In the case of a default, your rules require the executive secretary to make a recommendation that is consistent with the evidence and the presumptions found in the rule. It does not specifically provide for a remand or for alternative action. However, since you're the body with authority to take final action, you could remand the case, which I have seen happen, and order the executive secretary to bring an alternative recommendation, as long as that alternative recommendation is supported by the evidence that is provided to you, the precedents of what you have done in the past, and the rules. Next slide. In the case of a consent to discipline, it will come with a summary of the facts, allegations, the presumptions that are applicable, also any mitigating or aggravating factors and evidence that was relied on. You have several options when it comes to you. Number one, you may approve the consent to discipline, after which the executive secretary makes the appropriate notifications and recordings. Number two, you may simply reject the negotiations and offer the educator a hearing. Number three, you may remand the matter back to UPAC. And if you do this, you can either include issues or questions that need to be addressed, or you can provide alternative terms and disposition. If the educator agrees with your new terms and disposition, it will be brought back for your approval again. Alternatively, the educator may request a formal hearing at this point in time. And finally, there's a catch-all provision in your rule, which allows you to take other action consistent with your own disciplinary rebuttable presumptions. Next slide. The final format that a recommendation comes to you is in the form of a formal hearing recommendation. Based on the recommendation of the hearing report, you have several options. Like the others, you can choose to approve it, and the executive secretary will then take the appropriate action to make recordings and notifications. Number two, if you review it and you believe that the requirements of due process have not been met, you can remand the case to UPAC with direction to cure the due process issues. So that's the second thing that you look for is, was due process met? Number three, if you have factual questions that may still need to be addressed, you may remand the case and request the executive secretary to contact the educator to respond to your request for additional facts. The educator has two choices at that point in time. They can either simply provide a response to you with those additional facts, or they can request a hearing to respond to your request for the additional facts. This would be a hearing before the full board to respond to that request. This is a very unusual request, which I have never seen happen. And the reason why is because the UPAC hearing process is very thorough, and it's comprised of individuals very familiar with the expectations of educator behavior. With this in mind, it's very unlikely that they would have left large factual issues unaddressed. If this does result in a hearing, your rules state that the board would then issue a final decision with official findings. The fourth option is you may issue alternative findings based on the UPAC hearing record and report. Note that you cannot go outside of the evidence and findings that are in the UPAC hearing and report. You also must specify the reasons, including the evidence, presumptions, and mitigating and aggravating circumstances that you considered for your failure to accept what the hearing recommendation was. Then your revised recommendation would be attached as an addendum to the hearing report, and that would constitute the final board action. And finally, there's a catch-all provision again that says you may choose to take other appropriate action consistent with due process and Rule 215. So your rules of the presumptions that you have made. Next slide. So when you look at this all together, I know it looks overwhelming, but if you look at each one separately and see that you have these different options to review and make sure that the educator has received appropriate due process, then you'll make sure that you make legally defensible decisions. Next slide. The decisions that you take, the state code says are final actions, but you need to keep in mind they are final administrative actions. Next slide. In the very next section of the code, that it says the educator may seek judicial review of the board's final administrative action. So any educator who is unhappy with the final administrative decision that you make as a board can be taken to court to have judicial review. Next slide. In order to make sure that those decisions stand and are not overturned, it's important that you follow all of the rules. As you can see by the brief overview of the UPAC process that Ben gave, and the little bit that I've provided, a lot of time and energy goes into formulating recommendations that come before you. This is not just on the part of UPAC, but the LEAs are involved, schools who employed the individual are involved, the educator is highly involved, him or herself. And the final decisions you make will have a lasting impact on the lives of the individual educator, the educator's family, students, schools, and the integrity of the education profession. With so much at stake, it's vital that the decisions that you make be legally defensible and able to withstand judicial review. Providing you with knowledge of this process and the standards by which your decisions will be reviewed will strengthen your ability to make legally defensible decisions. If your final decision is challenged, the court determines the standard of review based on whether the individual is challenging the factual basis of the case or your application of the law and the rules. A standard of review is the amount of deference the court is willing to give to your decision, how much the court will rely on, lean toward, or submit to the final decision of the board. Next slide. Court cases in Utah have provided that the standard of review that will be applied to your interpretation of facts in a case is called the substantial evidence standard. The court will look to see if the evidence stated in the decision to support your decision was adequate to convince a reasonable mind to support this conclusion. Number two, whether it was supported by substantial evidence based on the record as a whole. So everything that's written that we've turned over to the educator, they take that to the court, and in effect, the court looks over it to see whether it's substantial evidence and whether it is adequate to permit meaningful appellate review. When the agency's findings are inadequate, the case will generally be remanded or overturned. Next slide, please. If the court is determining whether you as a board have correctly interpreted a statute or a board rule, the review will be based on whether you have abused the discretion delegated to you by statute. The court will simply weigh whether you have reasonably and rationally interpreted the applicable law. Next slide. In determining reasonableness and rationality, the court will look to prior interpretations and actions you've taken. They will look at whether the current decision that you made is in line with previous decisions you've made. And if it's not, whether there's a fair and rational basis for your deviation from prior decisions. If there is not fair and rational reason for the difference, your decision may be seen as arbitrary and capricious. The Utah Court of Appeals has stated the failure of an agency, the board in this instance, to make adequate findings of fact on material issues renders its findings arbitrary and capricious unless the evidence is clear, uncontroverted, and capable of only one conclusion. So it's so important that you base your decision on facts which are supported by the evidence, not on, well, if they did this one time, I'm sure they must have done it other times as well. We have to base that decision on the facts that you have and the evidence that you have at hand. Based on prior appeals of administrative decisions, the most likely causes for a court to reverse a decision of an administrative agency like the board will likely be an erroneous interpretation of application of law, a failure to follow prescribed procedures or rules, that the decision was based on facts not supported by substantial evidence, that the action taken was contrary to the prior practice, or that it was otherwise arbitrary and capricious. The last slide. So in order to assure that your decisions will withstand a challenge in court, you should consider each time, did you follow law and rule? Are the facts relied upon supported by substantial evidence? Did you follow the presumptions and precedent, or did you provide a reasonable cause for deviation from them? Is the decision arbitrary or capricious? If you have a yes to the first three, you should result in a no on the last one, and your decision should be legally defensible. With that, I turn it over to see if you have any questions.
Remember Klein, I know, has a question. Oh,
Natalie, did you have a question or did you take your hand down?
No, I don't have a question.
Okay, sorry. I thought I saw it up at the beginning of that presentation. Let's go with Board Member Cannon and then Board Member Hymas.
Thank you. My question is just about how well updated is Cactus in reflecting what is current with a particular educator in terms of their UPAC status, and how well does the national body keep up and follow the status of these educators? So I'm just wondering, you know, people move around a lot, and how well does information we might need to know when hiring someone follow them on the teacher database?
I'm probably the one to field that, I think, if I may, Chair. My assistant will generally update Cactus and NASDAQ within a few days after the board takes action on a case. So from our end, we update that really quickly so that LEAs can see what's going on, that other states can see what's going on if it results in a NASDAQ report. NASDAQ, it's kind of up to the other states involved. We don't control that, but we update that promptly.
Ben, how can you just let me follow up and say, how well does Utah use NASDAQ data in terms of following up with educators that are coming in to be hired in our state?
So our process with NASDAQ is my assistant compares our entire Cactus database to NASDAQ once a year to see if there's anyone that has any hits. And if they have a hit on NASDAQ, if we see that there's been an action against their license in another state, we follow up, find out what's going on in the other state, and if appropriate, we can take license action against them here in Utah.
Is it reflected at all in Cactus when you find that?
If we get a hit from NASDAQ, we would put a flag on Cactus and open an investigation here. So yes, we would update Cactus with that.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Board Member Hymas.
Yeah, if you could, I just had a quick question. It's on, I believe it's slide 5, and I don't know if you have it in front of you. It talks about UPAC. It says UPAC shall open a case most readily when, and then it has a list of 5 items there. One of them says the educator has prior UPAC discipline. I know that with the different penalties that are given to educators, sometimes it's a year, sometimes it's a letter, sometimes it's lifetime. If they go through the process, let's say they have a 1-year ban, and then 5 or 10 years down the road, something else happens. Do you refer back, or do we refer back to that first incident and say, no, this is 2 strikes, or is there like I don't know, like an expiration date on what they've done the first time? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. If I may, Chair. You know, we have had cases where we've gone back and looked at prior similar misconduct that's happened 10, 20 years ago. It's kind of just a matter of how much weight UPAC and the board feel is appropriate in a given circumstance. When we're looking at what we call aggravating circumstances, the rules basically say that UPAC and the board can evaluate the facts and determine how much weight should be given to that, how aggravating it should be. So passage of time may lessen the aggravating weight in the board's view, or it may be something that doesn't. It's just kind of for the board to look at the facts, kind of the nature of the case, and make a determination as to how much it should influence the decision.
But there's no like 10-year clause that says, oh, we're gonna completely wash this in 10 years, and we'll always have that information. Is that right?
Generally, we don't have any process to expunge files, anything like that. We always have access to old files if there's been prior UPAC discipline.
Thank you. Expunge was the word I was looking for, and you found it, Ben. Good job. Hey, just humor me, please. I don't know what a letter of education, it says letter of education or letter of warning. I don't know what a letter of education is.
So a letter of education is the lowest level of discipline that we impose in a case. We give a letter of education if the educator has come close to the line but hasn't gone over the line. So it's basically to tell the educator, we don't necessarily think that you violated the standards, but we think you came awfully close and you probably ought to reshape your thinking a little bit.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Great questions. Thank you. Board Member Cannon.
Sorry, I forgot to take my hand down.
That's okay. Seeing no other hands, we're going to move right into our next section, and we appreciate our presenters and all the things that we have just learned. So we're going to move right into our funding study section, and we'll go ahead and have Chair Huntsman give a quick 5-minute introduction, and then we'll move right into Patrick Lee giving us an education finance refresher. We'll move into Alexander Berg Jacobson from Wested, talking about some funding study key takeaways. And then Tiffany Stanley and some study researchers will talk about priorities and roles and the way forward. And then after that will be the time where we will have 45 minutes to have a discussion led by Chair Huntsman. And that's when we will talk about priorities and roles. So if you have quick questions that can be answered as the other presenters are presenting, go ahead and put your hand up and I will try and see you and get to you, and hopefully Vice Chair Belknap and Chair Huntsman are watching with me as well. But if you have a comment or a discussion or a debate or something of that nature, there will be time for those types of comments later when we have our 45-minute session with Chair Huntsman. So Chair Huntsman, let's go ahead for your introduction.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here today. I'm greeting you I'm inside a building. It's a school. It's Midway Elementary. It's a really fun school, and they allowed me this nice little space. It's an older building, as you can see with the block walls and that, but education is happening here. I'm actually here to help set up a field day event that my daughter's a teacher here, that she runs their big field day that will be tomorrow. But so greetings from here. But on this subject of education funding, I know you guys can read and you saw kind of the timeline. I'm not going to take a lot of time here, but our objective here is to help us get prepared. Our non-objective is to dive back into the weeds of this study that we've all read, and there's been previous presentations, but this is really about next steps and where do we go next. As many of you know, I've talked about this previously, as public ed appropriations have been engaged in this study, and some background on this. We've always looked for betterments to public education, and in the funding environment is another one of those places. We're always trying to do it better, but at the same time, we've got some challenges, and that is the challenges are before us is our funding mechanisms that we have in place. It goes back to the 1970s, and the last look at these formulas and that were in the 90s. Now, I think hopefully some of you board members that are very young were probably born right around when this, but some of us have been around through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and here we are way into the 2000s. So these funding formulas and the way the applications are a little bit old, should say. Hopefully nobody takes offense to that. But it's the legislature, and then also us as driven in our finance committee and others are saying, can we do it better? Also in the same space of funding studies, and with the funding study and opportunities for change, is there's a burden attached to all of these line items that we have to justify the reimbursements and that in the money that goes into our LEAs. And as many as you know, this last legislative session with, I believe if I get this correct, House Bill 300 and House Bill 42. And it's like, okay, well, let's build a better box. Let's do something better for our LEAs and compliance and submittals and all of this. There's a lot of it's tied to our funding. So I'm excited about this opportunity that's before the board. It is the lifeblood of making education happen because it funds it. And that's why we have so much fun in finance, is because we get to play on the finance side of things. I'm making up words here as we go. So that's a little bit in a why. And then we also have identified other needs too, by the way, of challenges as we've evolved in public education that need to be addressed. So that's some background. And towards the end of the presentation, I want to get to the space of next steps and moving forward. So the primary research objective on here, and this is Patrick Lee will get more into this, section 53F-2-103, but I'll read it for those that are listening. Determine the extent to which current funding formulas meet their intended purposes and provide students reasonably equal education opportunities. This is what we're striving to do as we move forward. And within the study is looking back and then also helping us identify some of our weaknesses and then where we're going forward. So Patrick Lee will, I guess I'll turn the time over to you unless there's any questions on the introduction. Are we good to go, Chair?
I don't see any questions, but for one, I'm really happy that you just called all of us born in the 70s young. And I'm just on the cusp of that, so I'm feeling particularly happy today. So thanks for that. Go ahead, Patrick.
Your happiness is important.
Thank you, Vice Chair Davis, and thank you, Chair Huntsman, for that start. So School Finance Director Patrick Lee. I am going to be presenting this, but we do have our MSP administrator with us, Jay Caltrow, who is our resident expert in all of our funding formulas. Just for the board's information, and probably some of you are already aware of this, is that Jake and I have already started to meet with Ben Lishman and Emily Willis at the Fiscal Analyst Office in a review of the funding formulas for the minimum school program. And so that is connected to what we're doing here, obviously, and will be part of this study overall. But I did want to go through some of the statutes as well as touch upon the structure of the minimum school program, as well as the voted and board local levies. So first of all, the minimum school program means the state-supported public school programs for kindergarten, elementary, and secondary schools as found in 53F-2-102. The purpose is that all children of the state are entitled to reasonably equal educational opportunities, regardless of their place of residence in the state and of the economic situation of their respective school districts. Establishment of an educational system is primarily a state function. School districts should be required to participate on a partnership basis in the payment of a reasonable portion of the cost of a minimum program. Each locality should be empowered to provide educational facilities and opportunities beyond the minimum program, and accordingly provide a method whereby that latitude of action is permitted and encouraged. So looking at the funding structure of the minimum school program, the MSP includes a program or allocation funded by a line item appropriation or other appropriation designated as follows: the basic school program, the related to basic programs, the voted and board local levy programs, or minimum school program. And so in the graphic here, you can see the funding structure for the current fiscal year. We have the basic program, which is just under $3.2 billion. The next would be the related to basic programs, just under $1 billion. And then the funding sources from the voted and board local levy revenue, $811 million, and then voted and board local levy state guarantee is 213. So you can see kind of overall revenue amounts and how the program is divided up for the minimum school program itself. Okay, the statutory purpose is found in 53F2-102. I kind of touched upon this already, but the basic state-supported school program, basic program, or basic school program means public education programs for kindergarten, elementary, and secondary school students that are operated and maintained for the amount derived by multiplying the number of weighted pupil units for each school district or charter school by the value established each year in the enacted public education budget, or what you'd find in the Public Education Appropriations Acts. So the basic school program, or what's often referred to as above the line, when, sorry, I'm using my hands to try and think about this and explain it, but the above the line basic program, you would imagine, I don't know exactly where this is derived from, and I probably would have to ask Ben Lishman, who's been doing this for 20 plus years, but Ben creates a table each year that outlines all of the programs for the basic school program and the related to basic programs. And in this table, there's the basic program in the top, and then there's the line, and then below the line programs are related to basic. But in the above the line programs, the WPU programs included our kindergarten, grades 1 through 12, necessarily existent small schools, professional staff, the special education add-on, special ed preschool, special ed self-contained and extended year, the career and technical education add-on, class size reduction, foreign exchange, special ed impact aid, and extended year for special educators. And then, as you're all aware, the enhancement for at-risk students, which up to this point has been below the line in the related to basic programs, that will now be moved above the line and become a WPU-based program in the basic school program and become the EARS add-on. So continuing on the minimum school program structure, the related to basic below the line programs. So what I did is I just kind of organized them into the different funding amounts and the programs throughout the related to basic, which all in all, I believe, and Jake may correct me on this, there's somewhere around 30 different programs, and that's changed from year to year, depending on which programs have been kept. But the programs that are the big hitters include the to and from pupil transportation, charter school local replacement, educator salary adjustments, the teacher and student success program. And then, of course, school land trust program is in the next threshold, youth in custody, student health and counseling support. And then some of the, I guess, lesser funding amounts in the related to basic, which in the next slide here would be, I'm not going to read through all of them, but they're between 0 and 25 million. So you have different funding ranges for all of these different programs. But it includes, you know, a smorgasbord of programs, which you're likely familiar with, from adult education, digital teaching and learning, to some of the rural transportation grants. So those are all of the below the line programs that are funded, you know, slightly separate from the WPU above the line. So the weighted pupil unit, getting to this funding mechanism, the weighted pupil unit or WPU or WPUs means that unit of measure of factors that is computed in accordance with 53F-2 for the purpose of determining the cost of a program on a uniform basis for each school district or charter school. So the WPU value is, as most of you are aware, is set each legislative session by the legislature. And you can see over the more recent years, our upcoming year, the WPU value has been set at 3,809. Current fiscal year is at 3,596. And then, of course, the prior years in fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 19 were a bit less. So some of the basics on the WPU formula and weightings, the very basic formula for one WPU is one ADM student, where ADM is the average daily membership, which measures student enrollment on a full-time equivalent basis. And so the WPU weightings, for example, are adjusted for various student characteristics. For example, kindergarten, which is half day, 0.55, a regular education student, 1.0, a special education student, 1.53, and then there's the different weightings for the charter students at 0.9, 0.99, and 1.2. So the FY22 base amount of WPUs is 897,267 WPUs. This is compared to an estimated number of students enrolled at 673,854, or that equates to 1.3 WPUs per enrolled student. And these numbers, of course, for FY22 are what have been estimated in our Common Data Committee process, which occurred last fall and will again occur this coming fall. So the cost of operation and maintenance of the minimum school program, this starts to get us over to the voted and board part of things, which is a part of the minimum school program, but it's a separate line item. In 53F2201, the total cost of operation and maintenance of the minimum school program in the state is divided between the state and school districts as follows. Each school district shall impose a minimum basic tax rate on all taxable, tangible property in the school district and shall contribute the tax proceeds toward the cost of the basic program. Each school district may also impose a levy under sections 53F8 301 or 302 for the purpose of participating in the respective local levy state guarantee programs. And then C, the state shall contribute the balance of the total costs. The contributions by the school districts and by the state are computed separately for the purpose of determining their respective contributions to the basic program and the local levy state guarantee programs in 53F2601. So let's look at how the WPU and basic levy function as an equalization program. We'll do this just looking at some examples of District A, District B, and District C. So with these three hypothetical school districts, the same number of WPUs, same WPU value, same basic rate, different taxable values, however. So in looking at this in District A, you have a lower amount of local property tax revenue. And so the state is making up much more difference than it is for District B, who collects more property tax than District A. In District C, however, this district collects enough property tax to cover all of its costs and actually adds to a recapture amount for the state portion. And that adds to what the state can provide for other districts who are not able to collect that amount of property tax. Okay, now looking at this is the local revenue overview of the property tax. There's the minimum basic tax rate with the rate floor and the WPU value rate, the local contribution to the minimum school program. So this is required statewide, and it's estimated by the legislature and set annually by the tax commission. So for example, the basic rate for 2019 was 0.001661, and that was collected statewide. Then you get into the voted local levy and the board local levy, where with the voted local levy, that of course is approved or recommended initially by the local board and then must be approved by constituents or the voters. And then the board local levy is discretionary as set by the local school board. Between the two, they can collect up to 20 increments, where a tax increment is 0.0001. And so normally between these two is 0.00 up to 0.0016 for the voted and up to 0.0004 increments for the board. The others that are listed on here, we won't be as focused on in this funding portion, but as for the capital local levy and then bonds, of course, which are approved by the voters. So the intent of the voted and board local levy guarantee programs, the purpose is that it's intended to help equalize collections of property tax in the same or similar way as equalization in the basic school program. So school districts that collect less property tax revenue are assisted via these programs when they do not meet the state guarantee rate. So these are your basic code sections, which I highly recommend for some wonderful reading for each of you, if you would like to enjoy that. But seriously though, these are sections that I've read over and over to help me gain a better understanding of these programs. 53F2, 301, and 301.5 discusses the minimum basic tax rate. And you'll note that in these sections, you have the application to fiscal years 2019 to 22, and then from fiscal year 23 onward, where there was a bit of a freeze in section 301.5 and then section 301, which will take place starting in fiscal year 23. Then going on to the state guaranteed local levy increments in 601 and 53F8, 301 and 302, you have your voted and board local levy. And then the accounts related to this program, the minimum basic growth account and the local levy growth account are found in sections 53F9, 302, and 305. And those are all connected sections into the voted and board programs, as well as the state guarantee. So the voted and board local levy program appropriations for fiscal year 21-22 totaling at $919.23 million. The sources of that are from Education Fund 95 million, other sources, which would be your two accounts, 156 million, and then local funds of 668. And then those are appropriated to, for the voted local levy, 575 million, the board local levy 329, and then a portion for early literacy at 15 million. And I do believe that all districts participate in that program as well. So the final part of this funding presentation and kind of setting the tone for this, would like to discuss some of the key legislation that's taken place in recent years and has affected the voted and board and what's taking place in those programs. So in the 2015 general session, Senate Bill 97, property tax equalization amendments. This created the minimum basic growth account within the education fund. That's connected, of course, to the programs, and funding is collected to that account and then appropriated to the voted and board programs. And this bill also amended the calculation of the school minimum basic tax rate. It also required a certain amount of revenue collected from the minimum basic tax rate to be deposited into the minimum basic growth account. The next piece of legislation, and this did a lot, was in the 2018 general session, was House Bill 293, tax balancing revisions. This created the local levy growth account, which I mentioned earlier, within the education fund. It modified the property tax rate cap for the school board local levy to subject all districts to the same rate cap. It amended for a 5-year period the calculation of the minimum basic local amount and minimum basic tax rate. So if you remember back to those code sections where you have the code sections going through fiscal year 22 and then superseded a different section starting in fiscal year 23, that's where this happened. This bill also established both the weighted pupil unit value tax rate and the equity pupil tax rate, which guarantees the 20 increments, the tax increments for each school district, and increases the guarantee rate to expend the available funds. Finally, the bill directed the state board to use the local levy growth account appropriation to increase the number of guaranteed voted local levy increments, and second priority to guaranteed board local levy increments, and the guaranteed amount for each local levy increment per weighted pupil unit after increasing the number of guaranteed local levy increments. So that's a bit of a mouthful, and to give you a little bit of context, Jake and I recently presented on this, and Jake presented the formulas for the district business administrators who wanted a better understanding of this. So if it seems a slight bit confusing. Even the district business administrators have had challenges with wrapping their heads around all of the changes that have occurred. So hopefully we can get into more understanding of this and explanations of it, but just don't fret too soon about this. The final piece of legislation most of you are also familiar with is in Senate Bill 142 in the 2021 general session, the public education funding amendments. In the bill states if the indexing and growth described in subsections 3A and B result in a cost to the state in a given fiscal year that is less than the amount the legislature appropriated, the state board shall dedicate the difference to the allocation described in subsection 2BI. So we would have to dig into the bill a lot further because those two subsections have quite a lot in them. But to suffice it to say, what was done in the bill is that it allows the excess state funding to be spent by increasing the state guarantee rate beyond the base and equity pupil amounts. This would in effect be a kind of conditional rate because it depends on the first step and other subsequent programmatic changes made by the legislature in any given fiscal year or legislative session. Understanding a lot of this does require digging into the formula, which we won't do at this point, but connecting the code and the changes that have occurred to the formula in the voted and board, it does require a lot of, I think, effort and understanding, but definitely we have an expert on that in Jay Couch, our MSP administrator. But Vice Chair Davis, that's all of my part of the presentation for now. If there are questions, Jake and I could respond to those.
Thank you. I've been scanning for hands and have not seen any. So we appreciate your presentation. Thank you so much. And we'll go ahead and move on to Alexander Berg Jacobson.
Give her a hand.
Oh, we got board member Earl.
Sorry, you came up quick. I guess my question is this: how do we know? We've had a lot of significant changes in the last several years. Our funding study that was completed gathered data from several years back. So we've made a lot of changes in our state. How do we know the outcome of these changes? Do you know what I mean? Anyways, I'm just trying to understand what the projected outcome is, and maybe in some areas we just don't know until we get into it. Is that the case, or is there an analysis somewhere of the changes that were made 2 years ago and how it affects our current education distribution formulas and impact on local districts?
Vice Chair Davis, would you like me to respond to that? Okay. Board Member Earl, that's a great question. I do think we will need some more time to see some of these changes. I think one thing that the legislature is helping us to do in that, as far as from the board's ability to look into this, is we'll be hiring an economist that we can utilize their skill set to look into some of these types of things. The other thing that we're doing is what we're starting now with the fiscal analyst office, is looking into some of the changes that have occurred and some that might still need to occur by digging into the funding formulas themselves. And so between the board staff working with the staff from the legislative fiscal analyst, I think we'll be able to get more at some of that understanding of what you're asking about.
Okay, at one point in history, I felt like I kind of understood all of this, and then we started changing it again. And this is a few years ago, and now I'm not sure the impact it has or what mechanisms are moving. And that's a concern to me, because if I'm not sure exactly how those mechanisms are moving, surely it's difficult for parents and taxpayers and, do you know what I mean, other entities that are following educational funding. So I guess I look forward to additional insights on this if we have other professionals that are doing a deeper dive in this area. So thank you, Patrick. I appreciate your comments.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Board Member Klein.
Okay, so the purpose of this study then, I guess, is we're saying that certain schools in less affluent areas are receiving less funding. Is that correct?
Vice Chair Davis, would you like me to respond to that, or Chair
Yeah,
Huntsman? Or...
it seems like a question that would be in a later portion of the, and if you want to respond, if you feel so inclined, Patrick Lee, go ahead, but that seems like it will be answered coming up.
Sure, I agree that, you know, that's part of what will be looked at. I do think that it seems like the intent was to try and equalize things a bit more, that if things were getting, I guess, for lack of better ways to say it, out of whack, and it was more difficult for certain school districts to meet that standard for students, that this is potentially a way to do that. But I do agree with Board Member Earl and her questions that we do need to continue taking a look into the mechanisms that have been put in place to help create a better understanding. And I think that's what the board is wanting to take a look at here.
Thank you. Chair Huntsman.
Yeah, if I can just might weigh in, I think there's going to be more information further in the presentation here on the funding, but to Board Member Earl's question about changes, the tweaks that were talked about here and a little bit on the equalization are very minor. And in the space of where the legislature was looking at these, and Ben Leishman's with us too, he could probably speak better there also. One of the challenges that we have, and I have, and we've had in Finance Committee, and as new board members are coming and going, is having a true understanding of how public education is funded. And Patrick Lee spoke a lot about the voted board levies and the way things are happening there. There's the legislative piece that comes to the state, and then there's another significant piece that stays with the district. And then there's a piece that the charter schools are not even part of the conversation. And so it's kind of hard to separate that out, but on the state piece, that's what we're talking about here, is the slice that comes up to the state. And in every case, as these, and again, I think Ben Leishman can speak to it, and before the legislature took action, and it was all publicly displayed, was there's a list of who's going to be affected by looking back. Of course, we can't look forward. That's where an economist will play in a good place of what potential funding looks like, but they can look at things presently and looking back and then doing the comparables. And then on those spreadsheets, it actually showed those districts that would get a little bit more, and then those that would get a little bit less on some of these issues. But the significant portion of the funding, of course, is in the WPU and those other avenues. Did I miss that at all, Patrick, in that representation of the concern that that Board Member Earl had in moving forward?
No, I think you got that right, sir.
All right, I don't want to in a wrong way. I haven't made a career of this. I've been around the block a little bit. Hey, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Board Member Booth.
I was just wondering if very quickly you could help me understand why the charter weightings for WPUs are different than other LEAs, the 0.99 through 1.2. I just don't have that background in charter schools. What is the difference? Is there a simple answer to that, or is it just something I need to wait and discover later on?
Vice Chair Davis, is it okay if I respond there?
Please.
Okay. I honestly think when, and Ben, I didn't realize that Ben was here, could respond to it a little better, having been there when this happened. But I think it was in the, some of the initial setup and some of the adjustments that have taken place over time, compared to, the districts versus charters, maybe the meeting the needs of the students in the different settings, I think the weightings were initially set up that way. And whether we'll take a look at those weightings, I imagine we'll at least review that and some of the funding formulas. I'm not sure that I can answer your question the best, but I'll actually follow up on that and find out a little more information for you, Board Member Booth, so I can have a better answer.
Thank you. I appreciate that. May I have a follow-up question? Chair,
Yes.
who makes a determination as to what is above the line and what is below the line? Is that legislative? Is it, I'm interested that many purely academic content area kinds of things from the arts to special ed are below with transportation, and then it just seems like most of the academic concerns are above the line, and then suddenly there's just a couple. I'm just wondering if that in some way lessens I know it doesn't lessen the value, but does it kind of put them in a box that may make a certain content area or a certain program squirm? And who makes that determination?
Chair Davis, I bet Ben Leishman would love to weigh in, and it's a pleasant voice and a friend from the legislature. I bet he could answer that really quickly.
Great.
Yeah, I think there's a quick answer to both of those questions, the weighting on the charter schools and the second question with above and below the line. So Ben Leishman, would you be willing to share your knowledge with us?
And will you introduce yourself too and your big title there?
Yeah, so I'm Ben Leishman. I am the finance manager for the education budgets with the legislature. So first on, as far as the weightings, that was done at the early phases of the implementation of charter schools in the state. And at the time there was a underrepresentation of high schools or charter high schools. And that's because when we appropriate money or count WPUs in a school district setting that goes across the basically age range spectrum, so elementary, middle, and high school, the school district makes adjustments in how they spend that money. Elementary schools, by and large, are cheaper than high schools to operate. And so the funding formula wasn't taking that into account, and so it was harder for a charter high school to operate. So there was some work done at that time, and again, this was probably close to 20 years ago at this point, where we tried to model what was going on in school districts as far as that internal transfer that they were doing between elementaries and high schools, and found that elementary schools at the time and the districts we looked at were about 90% of a weighted pupil unit, and high schools were about 1.2. And quite honestly, the weighting for our middle school, junior highs was basically to balance. So that weighting came out to balance the budget. So it was basically looking at that, the two ends of that spectrum. Now I've forgotten the second question.
It is the above the line and below the line, who determines and why, and what does it mean?
So that is largely determined by the legislature, but I would say that the State Board of Education could certainly make recommendations to the legislature on what they think should be above the line or below the line. So as Patrick mentioned, the above the line is basically programs that are funded through the weighted pupil unit and have been determined to be foundational to the system or that foundation program that the state is offering. There has been very little change in the number and type of WPU programs over the years. As far as what we call below the line or those related to basic, those are providing supplementary or complementary services, programs, stuff along that line to the basic program. So they are seen as kind of enhancements in a way. So due to the way the weighted pupil unit works and how it funds the core of those educational programs in school districts and charter schools, it's really funding the spectrum of the academic operational aspect of a school district. And then the legislature, or in many cases, the State Board of Education, will identify, oh, we have an issue in this area. You brought up one aspect of the arts. See, like the Beverly Taylor Sorensen Arts Program is in the related basic program because there was some question or there was an issue brought up that elementary art education probably needed to be enhanced in some way. And so the legislature with the State Board of Education created this program called the Beverly Taylor Sorensen Arts Program. And since it's complementary to what's happening in core, I guess it's even a core academic program, but this is an add-on program that's supplementing what a school district or charter school receives from the basic program in order to support that academic or programmatic function within the school district. Does that help?
Thank you very much. I appreciate that very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Lishman, for joining in to the party with us here. Board Member Hymas, you're up on deck, and we are finishing this topic in just a couple of minutes.
Hopefully I'll be take less time than that. But I just wondered if you could answer another question, Ben, on the same vein of the WPU. It shows that special education kids are like at 1.2 something, or anyway, a little bit higher. But that doesn't fall true for special education kids of charter schools. So charter is strictly within the 0.9, 0.99 and 1.2, or is a special education kid regardless of where they are?
Correct, if I might. So the system is based on a way of counting kids. And I have always viewed it as you have a primary count and a secondary count, or what we often call as an add-on. And so every kid in the system is counted at least once and receives one WPU value if they're a full-time equivalent student. The system tries to then adjust for differentiated cost factors within the school system. So special education is one of those. And so a student in special education receives that first count, but then also receives an add-on count of that 1.53 in growth. So a special education student is weighted at 2.53 initially when they come into the system.
And that's regardless of charter or public. That's the question.
Charter or a district school.
Thank you. That was perfect. Thank you.
Thanks. These are great questions. All right, we're right on schedule. Let's go ahead and move on to Alexander Berg-Jacobson from WestEd.
Thanks, Vice Chair, and happy to be here. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Alex Jacobson, a researcher at WestEd, and I was one of the researchers that produced the funding study. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Jason Willis, who's also at WestEd, and Justin Silverstein, who's at APA, Augenblick Police and Associates, who is also a partner on the funding study. So I'm gonna be really brief and just give an overview of sort of what the study looked at and what the broad conclusions were. And then I think, with Tiffany's help and with Ben's help, we're gonna maybe dig in a little bit into what's coming next, and I'll chime in, I think, there as well. But just to start off, these were already reviewed by Patrick. These are the purposes within the minimum school program, and we thought of them as the principles of education funding in the state of Utah. And they really were our foundation for thinking about the conceptual framing for the work that we were doing in the study. And so we tried to draw conclusions and recommendations really draw them out from this as a foundation. And so we divide them into two categories, reasonably equal educational opportunity for all being the first, and then the second being local participation and determination, and seeing these two principles as being foundational. So then moving to the next slide, another way to view the conceptual framework for this study was that there were kind of these dual central purposes. There were other aspects of the study as well, but I think this is a good graphic for the main two purposes and sort of focus. So the first on the left-hand side has to do with disparities in property value and equalization. And Patrick talked about the current system and how that's set up with the voted in board local levies and the basic tax rate. And so, looking at this this issue of there being disparities in property values and ability to generate revenue through property taxes, that there's differences in education resources available through that process and generating local revenue, and examining the extent to which the current system adjusts for this to address any differences in opportunity, in inequality and opportunity as a result of that. On the right-hand side was this sort of question about characteristics, cost factors that are local to a particular school or district. And this could include student characteristics, some of which have already been discussed, poverty, limited English, proficiency, special education, or student with a disability, or the size, remoteness of the district or the school. And these also were viewed as potentially implying some additional resource needs. So a student with a disability has additional needs. And so a school or district with more of those students has also additional resource needs. And that could be a difference in education costs. And so we're looking at the extent to which the current system is adjusting for these differences in education costs and whether or not it's doing so in a way that addresses any inequality and opportunity. And again, back to that first principle of ensuring reasonably equal educational opportunities for all students. So again, there were other parts of the study, but I think this is a good representation of kind of the core purposes. So then I'll just quickly run through the overall conclusions. And the first that we came to was that the fundamentals of the system are strong. It's designed to be equitable. It's designed to make adjustments for differences in educational needs and to adjust for equalization, to address disparities in property, wealth. So that's in place. And so foundationally, it's very strong. But we did identify some opportunities for improvement within the current system. And so just again, to run through these really quickly, thinking about this reasonably equal educational opportunities principle, we identified some opportunities to better provide for additional resource needs, in particular for economically disadvantaged students and for districts that are particularly small and so have additional needs resulting from issues with scale and economies of scale, as well as a couple of other things. We also looked at equalization. And with respect to equalization, we found that currently the equalization system, the state guarantee and the voted in board is limited in its ability to address disparities in property wealth. And also that there might be an opportunity for rebalancing the state and local contributions as laid out in the basic program. And that was when Patrick was talking about the basic tax levy and how that identifies the portion of the foundation that the local district provides based on their revenue generated from the basic tax rate compared to what the state contributes, which is the difference of their foundation minus the local share. So we identified an opportunity to rebalance that, and by looking at other states that do a similar thing and seeing where Utah was, and also recognizing the limitations of equalization currently. We also looked at coherence at a systems level. And in particular, we identified the related to basic programs that Ben was just talking about as being an opportunity to continually revisit how well those different program purposes and the constellation of really specific needs, how well they align with the overall purpose and goals and vision for the system that the board has laid out. And to look at not just coherence in terms of priority, but also in terms of the level of funding, and does that reflect the how much priority the state has put on it in terms of its vision, looking at stability. Do these funds draw up and draw down in a way that's gradual enough to give districts a chance to adjust to changes in program funds? Looking at a continuous improvement and evaluation and seeing, as these different programs come out, looking to see if there's a process for each one's success to be evaluated. And then finally looking at whether or not the basic program and the related to basic are really coherent in how they kind of balance the two types of needs in the overall minimum school program that Ben described so well, as the foundational needs and adjustments and these more specific needs that are in the related to basic. Finally, we did look at local practices and decision-making policy in successful environments in the state. And this was based on their efficiency that we kind of estimated through our analysis, and also based on their performance and the populations they served. And we found some opportunities for strategic investments, and also just some general findings on what best practices are found in these, commonly found in these particular settings. So that's the overview of what the study found, and I'll pause there, see if there are questions.
Board Member Klein?
Yes, you've talked a lot about state and local funding. How does federal funding play into this? My understanding is that federal funding is largely distributed by need to take care of those inequities that come from the state or from the local property taxes.
Vice Chair, should I go ahead? So I think that the short answer is we were focused on the minimum school program, which is a state funding program. So really, in terms of our policy recommendations, we were really focused on that system and that part of the funding formula. That being said, we did include all sources of funding in our analysis to get at currently with all the funding that's available, what do we see as being the different needs for different populations? So it's a little bit of a caveat at the end there, but I think the main thing is to say that our recommendations were focused on the minimum school program.
Okay, can I have a follow-up?
Sure.
So I'm friends with a teacher that ends up floating from one school to another in her area, which covers both Title I schools and very affluent schools up on the bench. And she is constantly in awe of the inequity, but it's the opposite of what you would think it would be. The Title I schools are just swimming in money. They have so much money that they're purchasing new programs every year just because they have to spend the money. And so they're changing programs regularly because they need to use the money. Whereas if she goes up to the school up on the bench, that's a more affluent area, they've got a copier that's 20 years old that doesn't have all the latest technology for turning things into electronic PDFs or whatever, that this Title I school has everything, all the bells and whistles when it comes to the latest and greatest. And it seems fairly backwards to her. So I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm trying to gel what's actually happening on the ground and how federal funds are used to fill in those areas, and yet we're not even discussing them. And yet, our WPU is the same for all students. So I'm not seeing the inequity in the direction that you're trying to lead us in, if that makes sense. And so could use some clarification there.
Thank you, Board Member Klein. I think the question was if federal funding was used in the analysis. Sounds like the answer was, and just a gentle reminder for all of us, just quick questions in this part, and then the longer commentaries, we will have time for that at 4:15. That section will come there for sure. So I don't know if there was an additional question that on top of was federal funding used in the analysis. Was there an additional question there, Board Member Klein? Okay, thank you. Board Member Earl.
Yeah, And I guess mine is a little bit along the same lines as Natalie, because I saw a couple of analysis, but maybe I didn't see the thorough analysis on that. So I would be interested in that additional information. And then just because once again, the last couple of years, there's a lot of things that we've played catch up on. Do you remember if the regional service centers funding was also incorporated into the analysis of those models for our rural districts?
Vice Chair, should I go ahead and?
Please.
I believe it was all sources of funding that were available to us in the data we collected, which were the annual financial reports data. All sources of funding were included, with I should say the exception of a few specific categories, and those are outlined in the report. But suffice it to say, we focused on operations and maintenance categories, and so the big exclusions were transportation and food services and capital expenditures. So I don't believe that those three would be the regional service center. I don't think that would fall in any of those three. But I can't say for certain that's the case, but I'm fairly sure it was included. If it wasn't included, it was because it fell into one of those three categories. But like I said, I don't think it would have, and so it should have been included in. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have a follow-up?
Well, I think it's maybe appropriate for a little bit later, so I'll wait on that.
Okay, thank you. Chair Huntsman.
And just, I just want to respond just quickly to help make sure we're all keeping things in the right context. This study is about creating the opportunity for LEAs. And to Board Member Klein's question or comment about her teacher, this study did not get into every LEA's environment of how and they choose to spend their money at each school. And so as we've been working with the legislature, it's in their role to fund. It's in our role to influence their decision on the funding, on the minimum school program as things. So we haven't taken a picture of all of the funding at the same time, and the study did not go down into the weeds of every LEA and the efficiencies and what they choose to do with their Title I money and or something else. Those are all decisions made at the local level. And so to keep things in our context is, what are we doing in our space to create those opportunities for education at the LEA level, but we haven't crossed into exactly how that money would be spent. I don't know if there's enough time or money and or the pushback from our LEAs to give all of that feedback down and from buying copiers or not being able to buy copiers or on that local spending. So I just want to make sure as we're going into the next phase of this has everything to do with our opportunity within the minimum school program. And as we're moving forward, is there an opportunity for a betterment? Yes or no? If there is, what might it look like? And I just want to keep everyone's mind in the same place. And do we want to be proactive or reactive and use this funding study to assist us in those, to make an informed decision? But there's a lot more complex funding issues than what we have on the table today. So I feel like I'm lecturing, but I want to meet our board members' expectation of where we're at in here. So thank you, Chair, for allowing me to know that.
I'll give you the same gentle reminder that we will have time for that at 4:15.
I just make sure we meet everyone's expectations.
I'm just teasing you. We are grateful for the answer to that question. It's a good, helpful reminder. Okay, Chief of Staff Stanley, let's go ahead and move forward.
Okay, thank you. So Tiffany Stanley, Chief of Staff. So we now, with all of that context, want to pivot to discussing the way forward. So the scope for that discussion today is really the areas of study described in SB 142, which passed last session, which tasked the Public Education Appropriations Subcommittee with examining opportunities for improvement identified by the funding study and making recommendations to the full legislature. So it kind of outlines a 2-year process for this study with a focus in year 1 on the at-risk WPU add-on, on equalization and on economies of scale. And then a shift in year 2 to a focus on coherence of the related to basic programs and effective use of funds. Just a note here, the PEA chairs, I believe, are also planning to look at funding for students with disabilities this interim. We don't have a slide on that due to the scope of limiting to what's really required in SB 142 and also time constraints. But just wanted to make note of that. And of course, we'd be happy to discuss that time permitting. So quickly, given that we're going to be talking about roles, just wanted to take a quick moment to ground the discussion in governance of education funding at the state level and the respective constitutional roles of the legislature and USBE. So Chair Huntsman touched on this, but essentially, while the legislature has a lot to say in this space in terms of their constitutional role of establishing and maintaining a public education system and determining the level of appropriations and the mechanisms and the distribution formulas and also their role in tax policy, they do look to USBE for recommendations. They often delegate authority to USBE to determine consequential matters in rule. And additionally, USBE has a primary role when it comes to that effective oversight and support piece, which is really critical given that school districts and charter schools are generally provided broad flexibility in how the majority of money is spent, and we know how money is spent matters. So when we think about this, it includes not just program monitoring and auditing, but also implementation design and identification and scaling of best practices. So there's really a lot in that space that we are responsible for. So with that, the way we're kind of going to structure this next section is we're planning to briefly address each of the study items in SB 142 to hopefully give you just enough context to inform that big picture discussion on prioritization and roles generally, starting at 4:15. Hopefully we can keep on track to allow for that discussion, which is really important. So for each of these areas of study, we're going to describe what's driving it as a priority, then discuss how the funding study can inform the priority, and then provide considerations just to prompt thinking regarding USBE's role. We're going to try to split this up. So have Ben Leschman discuss the drivers. He's really the expert on the policy and the legislative history when it comes to these matters. So I really appreciate him joining us, and then have Alex discuss the insights, and then I'll discuss the considerations. And on that, just note that the questions I'll be posing under that are really intended to just be kind of prompts in terms of the types of issues that we might wrangle with and the role that USBE could play, as opposed to being issues that we can really address or debate today. So one last bit of information before we dig in. These are those big picture questions that can kind of guide the discussion about the way forward in that last 45 minutes. These were included in the agenda that was sent last week. We just wanted to present them to you now so you could be considering them as we walk through each of the study items. So with that, the first item is the at-risk add-on. And there are a couple of components to this, but the first in terms of growing into that full student weight. So Ben, if you want to briefly address the driver piece, and we'll go from there.
Yep. So just quickly, in conversations with, and all of this is based on the conversations we've had with the chairs of public education appropriations up to this point, and what they're planning on doing in subcommittee work. now through the next session. So as far as the at-risk program, that was, as you know, created as a new WPU program this past session. There's still some lingering work that needs to be done on that. As mentioned here, there's evaluating, I would expand that bullet to probably include what the weighting should be. Currently in statute, it's at 0.3 for the free and reduced price lunch factor, and I think 0.1, if I remember right, for the ELL factor. And then the major question here is, how do we grow into those factors over time? And so we'll be looking at how that impacts LEAs, whether we need to make some initial adjustment in those starting weights, and then again, how that grows over time.
All right, so now I'll just jump in here on the note about the study. The weight range that's listed here just reflects the amount of uncertainty in our findings with respect to the specific weight for economically disadvantaged students. But I think that whether you're at the bottom of that range or the top, based on our analysis, is more additional resources and reflects greater additional needs than are currently adjusted for in the system. So I think that based on our analysis, the recommendation is that there's additional needs. And so that's reflected, I think, in what Ben was saying about the growth and the target.
So in terms of, considerations, I guess the question here is, how will growing into the full weight factor into the board's legislative appropriations prioritizations? So, the current weight for the at-risk add-on that was created last session is 0.05. As Ben mentioned, the fiscal note or the bill provides for a weight of 0.3 in terms of full implementation. So that's the difference of 0.25. And the fiscal note for the bill estimated that final cost may exceed $230 million if 0.3 is that final weight. So in terms of that, how ambitious should that timeline be to grow to full implementation? And that's really a question of prioritization. The more ambitious the timeline, the more it'll cost in the next few years, and the more this item would need to be prioritized against, other issues and other needs. So any clarifying questions on the content of this topic? Okay. So jumping to another component to the at-risk add-on and question for consideration surrounding the use of the funds. So Ben?
Yeah, so there includes a component in basically providing large guardrails around the funding and how LEAs use that. But going back to those initial kind of foundational elements of the system is providing latitude of action. And so this, from what I'm understanding, this is likely a year 2 look, but is basically looking at how to set up a system to know that the funds are being used effectively and improving outcomes for students in those targeted population groups.
And in terms of where the study was on this, I think the case study analysis, which was also termed the successful schools analysis, really looked at, as I mentioned, what processes and practices are found in really successful, efficient, and effective environments. And one consistent finding was that there are effective processes in place, though not necessarily the same types of interventions or programs. So one thing that came through to us in our analysis was one element of success is establishing an effective process for deciding what to invest in. And I think this feeds into the driver in that it's all about what the use of funds is, but it may be how you decide what to do with it more than what exactly ultimately is done.
Yeah, so, one question that will need to be considered in terms of SB 142 requires USBE to monitor learning outcomes. So, how to operationalize that requirement, what outcomes would be monitored and how would they be monitored. I think another way of thinking about this is to ask, ask more of a proactive question in terms of what does a local system of resource allocation that leads to improved learning outcomes for at-risk students look like, and how can USBE support LEAs in creating those systems? And this could be an area that USBE is, particularly well positioned to address through its oversight and support role, and as that operationalization of that requirement comes into play. So, what clarifying questions on that content are there?
Okay. We'll take some quick questions. Board Member Earl.
Yeah, can you tell me? I'm trying to. So the best practices that you're referring to, those areas, is that based just on research, or is that based on Utah schools, those schools that we're finding the excellence of outcome? I guess I'm not finding it in the research here, where it's outlining where we're finding the pockets of excellence and what the resources were that were made that help to assist in making that, that are accomplishing that. Well, I guess I'm asking, was it based on just research from different areas, research projects, or was it actually based on educational excellence in Utah?
Vice Chair, I'm happy to, should I go ahead? So the part of the study that this is referring to, that I was referring to, is the successful schools analysis, or the case study analysis, which was a deep dive into practices and investment decisions being made in, I believe, 10 settings in Utah in particular that we identified as having, efficient and sort of effective spending. And we talked to both the districts and the schools. The schools were the focus, but the district was part of the process of engaging. So it was all focused on settings in Utah.
So is that, can I ask a question to follow up on that? Yes. If you had the individuals come in and you asked them specific questions, is that what you're referring to?
Yes, the case study analysis. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any other hands, so let's go ahead and continue.
Okay, so this next item, and Tiffany, did you want to give a summary on that first? Or?
No, go ahead.
Okay. As far as voted on board, so we're kind of shifting here from the cost factors included in that foundation program that we were talking about to equalization on the funding side. So here we're looking at those school districts, and as we know, there's a large range in the amount local school districts are able to generate from the same tax rate. This is an aspect of this property tax equalization, is an aspect that's been looked at from, I would say, probably the last 10 years in the legislature, and how to make improvements. So it's more of a continuation on that. Specifically, there's the factors of that 2008-2009 change in I can't remember it was the slide earlier on, that's requiring some review of legislative actions from 5 years ago. So this is basically looking at what that did. So there was that question that came up by one of the board members earlier, is we're going to go back and look at and see how those changes impacted some of the factors included in this report, and whether or not future adjustments, or what type of future adjustments, are going to be made, or are going to need to be made.
And from the results of the study, I'll just say that, reiterate what I said a little earlier, which was that the results suggest that the current equalization policies, the voted in board state guarantee, have a limited ability to make up for disparities in local property wealth. And I'll add just that it's not just in terms of the actual amount of funding that's added, but the capacity for local districts to raise. There's a cap on, as was mentioned earlier by Patrick, a cap on the rates that can be levied. And so even if every local tax levy was maxed, the equalization policies are limited in their ability to make up the differences between very property wealthy and very property poor districts.
Thanks. So yeah, in this space, I think, the question is sort of around what role USBE would like to play in shaping policies regarding equalization through the voted-in board as these, continued studies move forward and the continued legislative interest in this topic and the needs identified. So I think this one can be tricky because, the policy calls in this domain do ultimately fall more squarely in the legislature's role in terms of setting tax policy generally, but these conversations often tend to devolve into winners and losers district by district, and it can be difficult to keep that broader context and statewide objectives in mind. And so I think USBE can play a role in reflecting that broader context. So what questions on the content of this?
Board Member Straight.
I hope this is legitimate to what our topic is. Do these studies ever take cost of living into consideration in determining the value of dollars in any given LEA?
Alex, you want to take that?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. Hopefully I'll be able to address the question. I think with respect to our study, certainly it was on our minds and part of our cost function analysis, which was one of the major analyses in our study. It was on our minds the differences in local economic conditions and how they affect regional prices. In particular, we looked at and included adjustments for the price of labor and also thinking about remoteness as a factor. Both of those were cost factors in our analysis. I think with respect to this particular topic, I don't know that it was as much of a part of it. I think this was really looking at, based on the current policy and what's possible within the voted-in board, what are the differences in what is raised, what's added in the state guarantee, what could be raised within the cap. So I don't have anything to add in terms of this particular topic, but I did want to note the study was mindful of the differences in prices that are regional based on economic conditions.
Thank you. Board Member Earl.
Yeah, I think because this is local taxes, meaning that it's the local taxpayers that are actually engaging in this decision process, I think we have to be really careful how we weigh into this without getting into local tax issues. And for example, if we say that you have to meet a certain threshold of your percent of these levies, or you don't get a guarantee, we're almost forcing local districts to raise their taxes in order to get a portion of the guarantee. So I do think we need to be aware of what's going on here, but I think we have to be careful that we're not actually stepping into a realm of local taxation. So.
Is there a question there, Board Member Earl?
Just in our consideration here, that was just, and I guess not, so.
Okay, that's okay, thank you. Chair Huntsman.
And I just want to respond to Tiffany, I think addressed that a little bit when we usually stay out of this space and we kind of stay at what happens on the local tax side, and most likely will continue, but it still funds, it is a source of funding that rolls up to the state. So we are in the past and with our history, we've been very guarded when it comes to local issues.
Thank you. Chief of Staff Stanley, let's continue.
All right, Ben. So this is just another portion of the equalization conversation in terms of the role of the basic levy as compared to the voted-in board program.
All right, so maybe to make a differentiation here a little bit. If you recall back on slide, I think it's 6 or 7, it goes through and identifies different aspects of the system. And we just talked about the voted and board, which gets to the last bullet on that slide, which was originally intended for LEAs to be, or school districts specifically, to provide an education opportunity or programs beyond that foundational minimum school program aspect. Over the years intervening since then, the voted and board have become more integral to the foundation than they were once originally thought. So that's one thing that we have to think as we go through and do this work in the interim, is what role are the voted and board levies playing in providing that core basic program. The basic levy, as outlined in the next slide that we were talking about later, sorry to make you go back and forth so fast, is also looking at that primary component in that original slide up above, where it's saying that local school districts should contribute in the cost of the basic program. And so here, what we need to look at is the local contribution to the cost of all WPUs in line to where it should be. And I guess I go a little bit farther in that and saying that the basic program is the fully equalized component of our system, taking into account the cost to run a basic educational program, but then also looking at the who's paying side and between the state and the local school districts. So there's an element of that of, is the local component of that in line with where it should be? And then a secondary component, or I would even say maybe tertiary to that, is this aspect of House Bill 293 from 2018, which did some modifications on the basic levy in order to support equalization under the voted and board. And I know this is getting rather confusing, but there's a review process within that statute that the legislature needs to go through and determine whether or not to maintain the freeze or let it expire. And so those two components are really tied up into what the committee is going to be looking at over the next 2 years.
Thank you. Let's take another quick question from Board Member Lear.
I'm trying really hard to understand this. This is not my strong suit, but I am trying. But I sometimes think, the paranoid part of me says sometimes that you finance people write things in code so that us normal people can't understand them, and then you can have your way with things. But I'm sort of kidding. But I'm looking at this insight on this slide. Utah's basic rate is the second lowest among 15 states with a similar levy. Can someone put that in like simpler English? Does that mean our tax rate is very low? And how does it, and I'm really not understanding the connection to the levy. So is there somebody that can say that in a little less technical financial terms?
Vice Chair, I'm happy to give it a shot.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. So the basic levy and the basic rate in this slide, I believe, are referring to the same thing, or they're referring to the same tax rate in any case. And so I think what that statement is meant to reflect is there are 15 states across the country that have a similar approach to this full equalization that Ben mentioned, that Patrick talked about, where there's a set rate that every district must levy that identifies an amount of revenue that then is subtracted from the foundation amount, and the state contributes the difference. So every district under the MSP within the basic program, there's a total foundation. The rate is applied in the same rate for every district, but different amounts of revenue depending on your property values. And that's the local share of the foundation, and the state pays the difference. And in terms of that rate itself, it's the second lowest across all the 15 states that do this in a similar way. Is that helpful? I hope.
Let me check my understanding if I can. So you're saying that of these 15 states that have a similar system to ours, the amount of tax or the percentage of tax or some other word similar to that, our tax rate is very low among the 15 states that have a similar process. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. A similar process with respect to the basic rate within the context of the basic program. Yeah.
Equalization that takes place. So we are not paying locally into the property tax pool at a very high level. We're paying of these, again, 15 states were the second lowest in terms of how much we pay into the property tax pool. Is that pretty accurate?
Yes, I would say that the way the tax rate defines local share, the rate is very low, and so that translates into a lower local share.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's
super
fair.
helpful. That is starting to make sense to me. Thank you very much.
I'm not seeing more hands at this time, so let's continue on with the presentation.
Jim Moss is hand.
Sorry, I lied. Board Member Moss.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I've been lurking. Just a related question. Among those 15 states, do we know how those compare to the other 35 states in the way of equalization among districts of different, wealth? It looks like we score fairly low among those 15. I wonder how those 15 compare to the others. My understanding is that the way those 15 approach it is meant to provide greater equalization, but how does that stack up across the country?
Vice Chair, should I go ahead and respond?
Please.
So I don't have the specific, go through every state and how it lines up, but I can say a couple of things about kind of the comparison. I believe that most of the other 15 states have very similar basic rate, which is much closer to around, I believe it's 16 mils, I think, is currently our basic rate. I think it's more like 25, I believe, and I hope my colleague Justin Silverstein will jump in here if I'm wrong about that, but I believe that that's about where most of the other states are, and there are a few that are higher than that even, and there's only one other state that is below Utah's basic rate, but I believe they are quite far below, so they're a bit of an outlier across all the 15. So that's my recollection of kind of the spread. And I think we could follow up with more detail, the part of the report that addresses that in particular, if that would be helpful.
Quick follow-up?
Yes, please.
My question was not so much where we compare to those 15 states with a similar levy, but how those 15 compare to those who don't use a similar levy system in terms of trying to equalize across different districts of different wealth. Does that make sense?
Vice Chair, I go ahead and follow. So it does, it makes sense. And I apologize, I misunderstood the question. So aside from the 15 states that use this basic rate approach, there are a number of different ways that states go about defining a required local contribution, or how they kind of set policy around how much locally can be contributed into the state education funding system, generated through like a voted or a board type of levy, or that is part of this kind of foundation program. So I think I might actually ask my colleague Justin to jump in if he could add any more detail on the range of different policies. But aside from this pretty common approach, I think there's quite a bit of a range in how states approach this. But Justin?
Absolutely, Alex. So I think in part this is about the classic equalization like Alex is talking about. We have other states who are only guaranteeing a minimum amount. So the state might be doing providing all of that minimum, and then locals are building on top of that. So in the end, it becomes harder to compare simply because the mechanisms are very different. So you might have a guaranteed tax base or again, the guaranteed minimum. You have examples like I happen to be sitting in Colorado where tax policy actually has every district or most districts have a different required levy. And so it's actually a varied levy across all 178 districts. So it's a little hard to say. Most states are trying to define some level of equity, but it's easier to make an analysis of how well they're doing that through an equity analysis and less about this just one section of it because they're doing it so differently.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chief of Staff Stanley, how much more time do you need for your presentation? Do we need to stop taking questions at this point? We have 5 minutes left until our discussion. And I see one more quick question from Board Member Lear, but what are your thoughts, Tiffany?
It's up to you. We have, I think, 3 more sections: economies of scale, coherence of related basic programs, and effective use of funds.
Board Member Lear, can you ask your question really quickly?
Yes, it's pretty quick, and Member Moss's question prompted my question. I'm wondering if was there any attempt in looking at this, the 15 states and Utah's contribution, was there any attempt to look at the comparative student success or student achievement among those 15 states? This is just solely about funding. It's not relating funding to how successful are the students based on that funding. Does that make sense?
Please, Sir Alex.
Yeah, I'll get us started, and my colleague Justin might want to jump in as well. But in the first phase of the study, we did do an analysis of the level of equity across states and whether there was a local share that was associated with the more equitable states. Do we see any pattern in terms of equity and how much locals contribute? And we did not find that there was a pattern there. However, in the second phase, we took a deeper look at this question from the perspective of in the most equitable and least equitable states, how do they kind of approach contributions from the local level versus what the state is contributing? And one of the findings from that part of our analysis was that the most equitable states tend to put most of their funding through their equalized system, as opposed to it being based on local decisions on contributions through like a voter to board. So that was one finding, that in states that are the most equitable, they tend to put their funds more through their equalized formula, and the opposite in states that are the least equitable.
Yeah, and maybe we'll just take this up later because you kind of missed my question, but that's okay. I had a hard time asking it. So let's just save it. Thanks.
And thank you, Alex, for taking all these questions. You know, I keep calling on you because Justin doesn't have his camera on. It's like equivalent to sitting on the front row when you're in a virtual space. I see you and you're the good go-to there. So thanks for being willing to answer all these questions. Board members, I'm going to ask you to hold your questions so we can get through the next 3 sections. We have only about 4 minutes. And then if you will have a space for some quick questions at the end. And then if you have comments or additional questions, then you'll have time to ask those when Chair Huntsman starts his portion of the discussion. Chief of Staff Stanley, let's go ahead and move to the next section.
All right, so economies of scale, Ben?
Yes, so just very quickly, this is looking at mostly where economies of scale don't exist and cost factors are higher in order to provide those educational services. It's largely a rural issue, but maybe not exclusively. But there's been a long-term desire to try and address some of the cost differentials, or I would say educational opportunity differentials in our local school district, and primarily the rural school districts. The only factor we really have in the program at this point is necessarily existing small schools, which has this idea that it's addressing all things rural, where the formula is actually quite specific and school-based. And there needs to be some idea here about talking about just rural and not maybe necessarily existent or isolated in that case. So there are, basically this is looking at the degrees of economies of scale within our most rural and in many cases smallest LEAs, specifically school districts.
I'll just chime in really briefly to say that the study did find that what's currently adjusted in NES based on our analysis is not fully adjusting for the additional needs in these very small districts. But I would also acknowledge that, you know, there may be some complexity in some mid-sized districts that have particularly remote isolated schools within them. And that might be an area for, you know, continuing discussion. It goes kind of beyond where we left off in the study. But overall, we found that needs are greater for these small districts than is currently being adjusted for in NES.
Thanks. So yeah, I think here there's really a lot of work to be done to really address these issues in a coherent way. I think the researchers made a recommendation specific to economies of scale at the district level. But there's also several tentacles that are separate but related here with rural issues, remote, administrative costs, which sort of dovetails in with the concept of size and economies of scale. So I think this is definitely an area that USBE could shape by you know, taking steps to develop a recommendation, or as Alex said, I think we could begin teasing out the nuances at an individual district level. By bringing, you know, bringing together BAs and superintendents, the professionals on the ground that really know these issues to help develop some of the policy in this space. So with that, we can jump to the next issue in terms of coherence of related to basic programs.
So I view this really as looking at those related to basic program, and again, these are those complementary programs to that base program. And, you know, a lot of them are specific to a certain use or function, so they're restricted. There's little flexibility in LEAs in how you operate with them. And the trend of those programs has been more towards competitive grants or opt-in programs as opposed to broad interventions in the system. I would also add to that, years ago, the concept of the related to basic was to put in some regard kind of a pilot system to where you start an intervention, say you have a need in the state, you send money out to LEAs, have them test it, develop the programs, then at some point fold that into the basic program because it becomes foundational to the system after that. That's an element up until very recently that has been not very well used. And the related to basic just program, the number of categoricals within that program just continues to increase, largely with how much money the state has to spend. So.
And I think, Ben, you set me up so well because this idea of coherence and complement is exactly what our analysis looked at in this respect. And I think that basically our takeaway was there's an opportunity to continually examine the extent to which related to basic programs are really well complementing the other parts of the minimum school program, and an opportunity to evaluate kind of as Ben was suggesting, their effectiveness so they can be strategically scaled or drawn down.
I think Ben and Alex covered it well. I think we definitely have a key role to play in this space in terms of shaping these conversations moving forward. And, you know, could start by asking, you know, what are some of the opportunities? What are some of the risks? Some of the risks could include, you know, whenever you do something like this, there are distributional changes. So that needs to be considered. And then in terms of opportunities, I wonder how, this could dovetail with conversations of reducing reporting burdens, which is a priority and ongoing discussion. So with that, the final study item or area of discussion is around effective use of funds. So Ben?
Yeah, so here, this is trying to dovetail basically what's being put into the system and how it's being used. And there have been great strides made in adding funding to the system in the state, and we're starting to see some benefits of that. As you can see, what are we, number 49 now instead of number 50? But with that, there's also, with these changes in both the cost factors, like looking at the creation of the at-risk add-on, maybe some other adjustments in special education, necessarily existent or economies of scale, how are those impacting, and this question came up earlier, student achievement, and then the public ed chairs have expressed interest in trying to then look at mostly district equity, some of these questions and how are the funds flowing to the school site, and the differentials, and there have been some comments made on that earlier. How is that impacting programs at the school level?
In terms of the study, this is calling back to the case study analysis that came up earlier. But in particular, there were three areas of strategic investment that analysis identified in these 10 schools and districts that we dug more deeply into in terms of local practice. And these are listed here. I just would add the prioritizing staff support really has a lot to do with, based on our findings, collaboration opportunities for job embedded development and training, so that there's more of a kind of collective response to any sort of new strategic intervention, including, for example, data use or wraparound support, social and emotional learning. So we found these were things that were consistent in the settings that we engaged.
So again, in terms of this space, USBE, I think this falls very clearly into USBE's role in terms of that effective oversight and support piece in thinking through implementation design, how we structure grant applications, what needs assessments look like, and then thinking through monitoring, and as well as gathering best practices and sharing those. And then of course, there's a component here in terms of performance measure reporting. We collect and report many performance measures, and I think there's an opportunity to streamline those in terms of how they're reported to the legislature and the public to promote that transparency and effective use. So with that, we are done.
Great, thank you all so much. Let's take just a quick minute for any quick clarifying questions before we move into our discussion piece with Chair Huntsman. Seeing no hands, we will thank all of our presenters. You have just had a wealth of knowledge that you've shared with us today, and we're grateful for your participation. Thanks for visiting with us. Board members, let's move into our discussion with Chair Huntsman. And do we need to take a 5-minute break now that we're halfway through? I'm seeing some nodding heads. Chair Huntsman, is that all right with you if we take a 5-minute break?
Yes, I'd enjoy a 5 to 7 minute break.
Okay, we'll meet back here in, let's split the difference. It's 4:24, let's meet here at 4:30.
Okay.
Thanks.
Cindy, I think you're muted.
I'm not muted. I was clicking through pictures to see if anybody had cameras on so I could see how many people were back. I was just.
You were moving your lips. You
wanted
yourself.
I just wanted to make sure we had enough folks here that we could get started again. Oh, look at, now I see lots of faces. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I know that Chair Huntsman has some guiding questions that are on the screen, and I am going to ask, if you have not spoken yet, but you have had questions or comments percolating around in your brain, but you've been afraid to take time because you don't want the meeting to go over, I'm going to tell you now, we're not going to go over, and we want to hear from you. We have time to hear from you. So if you haven't spoken yet, I hope you'll lead out once Chair Huntsman gives us the go-ahead. Chair Huntsman?
Yes, and thank you. So the opportunity between now and the top of the hour when Vice Chair Davis ends this part of it is we have an opportunity before us, and I'm just going to reverse engineer this a little bit. The legislature is going to do something this next session. Public Ed Appropriations is preparing to do something in the space, and it's all been shared of the differential funding piece of WPU add-on, special education, all those that you see kind of in year one, and then there's some challenges with, not challenges, but opportunities that the legislature sees in that year two. The challenge before us is, are we going to be proactive or reactive? And so I'm hoping in the next half hour or with some other input that we kind of we're not taking action, but we kind of get a feel for next steps. And do we want additional information? That additional information would come to us in the form of furthering this study, changing the scope of work, amending the scope of work in a short time frame to assist us for this next legislative session, and or if there's other things that we want to expand on in this with this study, it would require amendments with time, scope, and dollars. And so as many of you remember, we set that FML set aside from a previous board meeting, but if we're going to ask for something and ask our consultant that's been engaged in this study to do something, we need to probably start it in June. So it'll be an actionable item. I'll prepare some drafts before the end for the interest of the board to move forward to help assist us in August and September and October in gaining information to help be proactive in these steps as we're moving forward. And again, we're targeting only specific funds. So the scope is a little bit narrow, but this is big, this is huge. This is something that will affect public education for a long time. So this is all about questions, and it might be even comments of what you think is important. So Vice Chair Davis, I'll turn the time back over to you, and we have myself and others that could certainly respond to questions, but I'm also tracking comments.
Thank you, Board Member Hutchings. And let me tell you, I would like to welcome you. I'm sorry your name was not on my list. I need to get an updated roll call list. We're glad you're here.
No worries at all. Thank you. Just one quick comment is that, and I was happy to hear several board members actually already ask this during the presentation, that I would like to see in relation to some of these funding questions is, how does the funding and these overarching questions relate to the academic outcomes? It was asked, and it doesn't seem like that was really a part of the study, but if we could bring in, and I know it gets really complicated with different schools and how those outcomes are measured, but it would be really helpful because our return on investment for this funding should be the academic outcomes of our students. And throughout this presentation, I haven't seen any relation to how this funding is related to academic outcomes. And I think I know I would really appreciate having a better connection of some of these questions and how they can recommend that it improves our academic outcomes.
Chair Huntsman, who would you like to answer that question if we have any of that data?
Well, I don't, it's to the study. So I don't have the study in front of me or down into the meat of the study, but does someone,
So,
Tiffany?
sure, and appreciate the question. And maybe Alex can wade into this, but just briefly, for example, the cost function analysis, which served as the basis for many of the findings, the way that that's structured is it's essentially a regression analysis, much more complicated than that, but where the dependent variable is academic outcomes. So it was very much a part of the study. We just didn't have an opportunity to get into the mechanics and details of the methodology of those different components. Does that help? Is there anything else, Alex, you would add?
No, nothing to add in the interest of time, but definitely happy to address more detailed questions, or Tiffany, maybe if it comes through at another time, because it is quite a complicated method, but you hit the nail on the head, so nothing to add.
Great, thank you.
Board Member Hutchings, do you have a follow-up?
No follow-up, just thank you. I think we would all appreciate some of that information shared in the future.
Yeah, so maybe if one of our presenters could just be thinking of a quick summary of if the resources impacted academic outcomes and how it did in what we learned. If we could hear that sometime today, that would be great. Board Member Straight.
I'm actually down the line about 3 or 4, so other people had their hand up first.
I'm actually taking people that we haven't heard much from today first.
Well, I always speak too much, so I'm not sure how I got there. But anyway, I'll go ahead. The discussion about what's above the line and below the line. I think we need to get more things above the line. The WPU is a basic standard of how we fund. And the more of these things that are important to us we get there, I think the better off we are. Special education is that way. We talked about the at-risk add-on. Now, last year, we did have the one-time funding of administrative costs for rural schools. Equalization, all these things, if we get them above the line, I think we're better off. Part of that, I think, is training and collaboration. Over the years, in the last few years, they added the ethics training. There's the suicide training. And now we're talking about our equity trainings. We keep adding more trainings, but we're not adding the time and paying for that time. And I think that's important. Collaboration is even more important to that, because that leads directly to what has been talked about earlier, which is, are we getting the bang for the buck? Are teachers prepared to come into the classroom like we used to have the quality teaching grants? I think we need to get more above the line in regards to teacher training and collaboration in order to have more efficient and effective education practices. Thank you.
Okay, so can I quickly respond as I'm taking notes, Chair? So all of that, yes. All of those opportunities to address those specific issues can come before us between now and the legislative session. So one of the challenges here, and of course we can speak more to what's above the line, those are like pretty much guaranteed funding sources, and that's a choice that the legislature has. So between now and if we move in that direction, we need to have really, really good reason for them to move that above the put more above the line. But to the question that's before us on the WPU and the WPU add-on, I'm hoping I can get some questions regarding that here in the next 15, 20 minutes of the public ed appropriation study that Senate Bill 142, because that's what we need to be preparing for amongst those other items. And within this study, if we broaden the scope of work in that, and our proposed recommendations to them actually come from some of the study findings, then it carries a little bit more weight in our ask as they move forward. I'm not trying to I'm just trying to direct us back into that one space that to Board Member Straight's, we will start in August, and we start our prioritization and our big rocks, whatever our ask are, and that seems like we just finished that. That we'll be doing a do-over on that, and so those opportunities will be there.
Thank you. And Board Member Straight, that might be something I have been thinking that might be good to bring up in our next section, which is the ESSER ARP part of the conversation, and perhaps there's some way to spend some funds there with your recommendation. Board Member Norton.
Yeah, I kind of want to go with, I'm hoping with what Chair Huntsman was asking us for, dealing with the WPU and WPU add-ons. And we have talked a lot about at-risk students. But I'm also wondering about our accelerated students. You know, it just seems like that is dropping lower and lower and lower on the scales. And yet it sometimes if we don't meet their needs, they become at-risk students. So, you know, I hope that we can keep some thought to our accelerated students and how we can best meet their needs. And then could I have just another follow-up on that outcomes?
Yes.
When we talk about outcomes, you know, as an educator, the first thing I hear is, I mean, that says to me testing. And I just urge whomever or however this is made that we either use testing that we're already using, or we find another way to weigh how the success of those funding dollars are, other than adding more testing in. We are at our limit on testing. Thank you.
Thank you. Board Member Cannon.
Thank you. As we discuss the West Ed study and what they found and their recommendations for changing the way education is funded, it seems to me like we are going to, in the end, have a list of winners and a list of losers. And I had some experience working on a federal issue a few years ago where they tried very diligently to incorporate a formula that would mitigate the impact of the winners and the losers. And it seems to me like making such a big leap as this in funding Utah public education that we might want to try to do something to make it less painful to institute a new funding formula for all of those involved. And I think it would mean better support among legislators and everyone if the gaps weren't huge in what we're trying to do to change the funding formula for education.
Thank you. Board Member Booth.
I'm wondering if Chair Huntsman or some of our more experienced and seasoned board members who have been here this entire study would be willing to identify how we might be able to use this funding that we do have available most effectively beginning in June in order to be best prepared to do whatever we determine it is that we're going to do in these adjustments to funding. And I appreciate what Board Member Cannon was just saying, that, you know, we've got to figure out how to minimize the overall impact so that we don't stir up the water in a way that, having just come out of COVID, we just fall flat on our face. There's plenty of irons in the fire already. So what are the critical issues that we need further study or further development on in order to make this transition most helpful for, first of all, students, and second of all, leaders of learning and teachers who have to make the magic happen in the classroom?
Chair Huntsman, I'll ask you to address that, and then let's have Board Member Earl and then Board Member Lear.
Well, we have opportunity in our next segment to talk about this short-term money that we have. But in every case, that from my history of being a board member, and we have tweaks to formulas and different things, there are always winners and losers. And one thing from my experience is a good portion of those LEAs that found themselves not in the gaining portion of it recognize the benefit, overall benefit to the whole state. And so they took it on the chin or took it in the pocketbook a little bit. Now, moving forward, though, it's all about moving on the, like, from winners and losers. Is with WPU add-ons, a lot of this is stuff that gets moved from below the line or just barely above the line into an easier space for LEAs to count on the money to keep coming, and also puts it in a place with less restrictions on the money as we pay it out. Of course, many of you know that on the WPU space, that's a really healthy space where everybody is, not everybody, but most LEAs are saying, put it all in the WPU, put more, just put more and more in there. So to come back to that question of opportunity, all of that will be weighed out as we're making our decision.
Thank you. Member Earl.
Yes, I have 3 comments. One of them is specific to what Janet and others have kind of talked about. I think part of this study needs to identify when there's too much of a distance between the funding we're using for these add-ons and the actual programs themselves. And what I mean by that is that it ends up incentivizing students it ends up incentivizing to have students in these at-risk programs versus creating opportunity for them to go beyond there. If that makes sense. So, anyways, I know that's more complex than that, but I think we have to be careful that we need to know where that number is, right? So we're not incentivizing, we're actually not creating a barrier for our underperforming students to stay in the underperforming category, but actually to reach outside of that. Otherwise, if it's so much money, districts, it's hard to move them out there. And then other comment or question is, does the money translate into educational excellence? If it doesn't, it's not worth our time, even if it's, whatever that is, we need to make sure we achieve that. One other thought or question is, and my question is this, it's a little different question in that instead of asking, how do we get the money to the district to get to their child, it's how do we get the child to the resources that will benefit them. So it's a little different question, but who is taking advantage of resources, or how can a family take advantage of resources that will benefit them? So it's changing it a little bit and putting that power back into the family themselves. And is there a way that we can better facilitate that dialogue? So those are my 3 questions.
Thank you. Board Member Lear, and then after that, our presenters are ready to answer the question that
a few people have asked today, and I'll just echo, you know, do the resources translate into academic excellence, or to what extent have we learned that resources make a difference academically? I think Board Member Hutchings asked the same question. So Board Member Lear, when we're after your comment or question, we'll move back to our presenters.
And that my question is exactly that. I only care about school funding to the extent that it manifests itself in students doing better. And that could translate to a lower graduate or a higher graduation rate, a lower suicide rate. Data, less bullying, so a healthier culture in schools. So you took my talking point away, but to Chair Huntsman's last talking point, what do we want more information about? I want more information about how the funding that Utah receives from all of our sources, how do our data about student achievement compare to other states that have a lot more funding than we do? And if more funding doesn't translate to better achievement, I don't care. So I think we absolutely have to connect the two. And I really don't care about all the complicated ways that we get there, but it is crucial to know what the funding translates to. And I also want to be sensitive to Kristen's point about it doesn't have to be based on testing. We can, to some extent, evaluate equity by seeing how minority students' graduation rates are improving, how they're taking more advanced classes, how they're participating more in IB programs. So those things are the things I care about related to funding.
Thank you. Front row, Alex, you want to tackle that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I really appreciate the question and the comments just now from Board Member Lear about the importance of looking at this, relationship between outcomes and the funding available. And as Tiffany mentioned, the cost function analysis, which was foundational to many of the findings in our study, did look at this very relationship. And so just what I'd say is that the analysis, in really simple terms, is set up to hold constant a number of different factors that we believe and are able to see in the analysis influence the costs and the spending required to reach the same set of outcomes. So we know different communities have different resource needs. And so this is meant to account for that. So we don't assume every community needs the same amount of funding. But part of the analysis was also to look at, considering all of these different factors, do we see that communities with more funding have better outcomes for their students? And is there a relationship there that's positive? And the answer to that question based on our analysis is absolutely yes. That across the state, and this was Utah specific, but across the state, when you consider all of the different things that change the amount of resources that are required, communities with greater amounts of funding spent had better outcomes on average for their students. And I'll also mention the specific outcomes we were able to look at, but I want to appreciate the comment that there's a lot of outcomes that are really important, and we acknowledge that. What we included was a function of what was available for every district, every school, collected in a consistent way that we were able to access, in particular for the outcomes at the student level, access at the student level consistently. So what we included was a measure of growth for students based on test score performance, but comparing students to other students with the same performance in the prior year. So how well did they do in the current year when compared to their peers who did the same in the prior year? And the other outcome measure that was included was school level graduation rates. So we had a balance of those two elements. Again, there are lots of really important outcomes. And so we appreciate the need to keep digging maybe on what the right measures are for student success. But in the context of this analysis, those were the outcomes included. And the last thing I'll say is the slide up that is being shared is just specifically looking at how the predicted costs looked for schools based on the percentage of students with who are economically disadvantaged at the school level. So schools that have a higher percentage of those students, the model predicted, our analysis predicted they have greater costs. And this is holding constant other cost factors and outcomes. So to get to the same outcomes, if you have a higher percentage of economically disadvantaged students, then your costs are going up, and it's a pretty linear relationship based on our analysis. So I hope that addresses the question. There's a lot of additional detail in how this analysis is set up and sort of what methods were used. I don't think we have time for today, but I'm hoping that gets at what was being asked about, and if there are additional questions, maybe there'd be opportunity later to address.
Yeah, that helps a lot. I had the same question, and that's very helpful. Thank you. Chair Huntsman? Oh.
Yeah, thank you. We're about out of time here, but we have some really good questions here that get down in the meat of the study. And I've taken some notes on opportunity that's before us. And so I'd like to remind board members that we have a process. I have a question. So if you could get your questions, is this safe to say to you, Chief of Staff Tiffany, that you can answer that question and then the body can benefit from it when we follow that procedure? I think they're great, awesome questions, but in the interest of time, we're not going to get through them. But also in the interest of time, over this short period of time, let's try to get these questions answered. Will that work for you, Tiffany? Thank you. I think this segment is out of time now. I just want to thank everyone, if I could, while I just have a minute here. Ben Leishman, thank you for joining our meeting today. These are a lot of first board members that we've been dealing with, and to be able to be on the front end of have the opportunity to be on the front end of some of these proposed changes, and as we communicate with public appropriations and the legislature, this is a good invite. I'm confident that we'll do our due diligence as we've done in the past as we prepare for this next session. I want to thank those West Ed folks for coming again. We just keep bringing you back and pounding into this study, and hopefully we can have some good amendments and to your scope of work to help bring more information that helps us with our opportunities that are ahead of us here in the future. Thank you for being here. Thank you, staff, too, for preparing this. I'm done. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair Huntsman, and to all of our presenters. And I noticed, Vice Chair Belknap, did I miss a hand that you had up? Okay. Board Member Booth, did I miss a hand that you had up? Okay. All right. Well, let's move right into our next section, seeing no other hands. And that's going to be conducted by Sarah Young. And she's going to lead us into a discussion about, we're not supposed to call it ESSER 3, right? We're supposed to call it ESSER, what is it? ESSER A, not AYP.
Close, ARP.
ESSER ARP.
And it's actually flipped, so it's ARP ESSER. But yes, no, lots of acronyms, but happy to have this opportunity.
All right, ARP ESSER, let's go for it. Thanks, Sarah.
Great, thank you. So appreciate the opportunity to be here today. My name is Sarah Young, and I am our Director of Strategic Initiatives here at the Utah State Board of Education. Today, I am just going to provide kind of a high-level overview of where we are in terms of timeline and process related to the state award for ARP ESSER funds for the K-12 system here within Utah, and then provide an opportunity related to answering questions or receiving feedback related to the draft documents that we've released that'll be referenced in this proposal. So as far as our process goes, as a friendly reminder, The American Rescue Plan is the third set of federal funds that we've received in terms of response to COVID-19 for the state K-12 educational system. The total award that we are projecting receiving is over $615 million in terms of awards, not just at the state level, but primarily at the local level, noting that over $550 million of that will be distributed according to the federal formula to our LEAs directly. In addition to that, the 10% that is available for the state reserve does have federal guidelines around what it can be spent on. And that does include 5% of the total award to address accelerated learning, a little over $30 million specific to that effort, as well as 1% for evidence-based summer enrichment programs and another 1% for evidence-based comprehensive after-school programs. As part of ARP ESSER, in an interest in providing these funds to the states as soon as possible, recognizing the impacts of COVID-19, the U.S. Department of Education moved to make the initial award of 2/3 of the total award value to the states on March 24, 2021. So we do already have a grant award notification letter from the U.S. Department of Education for a little over $410 million of the total projected $615 million that our state has been allocated. As a part of that, the award letter that we received does indicate that USBE must submit a state plan for the total comprehensive award to the U.S. Department of Education in alignment with the authorization and total awarding of the funds. So let me give you a timeline of the action steps that we've taken here at the agency to be able to meet that expectation. So the time begins on April 21st, which is when the state ARP ESSER template was released from the U.S. Department of Education. This is the template that we have responded to in terms of all the individual prompts that we are required to provide a response for in relationship to the total plan. On May 3rd, USBE writing assignments were reviewed by USBE leadership, and we here at the agency really deferred to the expertise of our staff and created cross-department writing teams to be able to draft responses to each of the required sections within the state template. Our staff turned that around in 8 business days in terms of being able to then create a comprehensive draft that was reviewed by myself as well as Chief of Staff Tiffany Stanley for coherence, making sure that we have all of the required components addressed, and was presented to leadership for a final review on May 13th. We released the draft document for our state plan on May 17th for public comment and proceeded to promote that under the COVID-19 website banner. In the state plan, we are requiring that our LEAs engage in meaningful consultation with stakeholders to develop their local plan. This is a federal requirement, not just at the LEA level, but the SEA level as well. And specific to the LEAs meeting that particular criteria, in our plan, we have that demonstrated by having the local plans approved by the local school boards in a public meeting. In addition to that, USBE is encouraging our LEAs to complete a needs assessment to inform their plan development. Although this is not a required component from the federal level, we will note that in terms of an LEA being able to really assess the needs of COVID-19 and design a plan to address that, it's a best practice that we are encouraging in our LEA certification and application template. And last but not least, I will highlight that USBE is asking our LEAs to describe how they will ensure the interventions that have been selected will respond to the academic, social, emotional, and mental health needs of students due to COVID-19. Again, this is a requirement as part of the SEA template related to this particular program. And so we're asking our LEAs for their strategies around that to be able to meet that federal requirement. As far as the ARP ESSER award timeline goes, the previous timeline really spoke to our application steps to be able to prepare that application to meet the U.S. Department of Education deadline. This timeline really speaks to a more global view of actions that your staff have taken related to being able to move forward with this funding in partnership with the other state agencies, as well as preparing for supporting our LEAs and their process in this effort as well. So you'll note we did receive our grant award notification for 2/3 of the funding on March 24th, as previously shared. We were requested to submit an LEA spend report related to both ESSER 2 as well as ARP ESSER timelines and expectations to the Legislative Fiscal Analyst Office, as well as the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget. And we did submit that, and it was received as part of their May 18th hearings that happened in preparation to special session. The award was appropriated to the State Board of Education during special session on May 19th. And so now we're here in step 4, which is working towards being able to have an application that is ready and in a final format for you to approve in the June board meeting. Once we've done that, our plan is to then work through the Utah Grants Management System with our leaders from financial operations to then release the application to the field so that our LEAs can begin the application process on June 15th of this upcoming month, noting that we want those funds to be available related to needs they may have in terms of summer activities and planning to address those, like I said, community needs. Last but not least is always the question of reimbursement. This is a reimbursement grant, as has all of our COVID-19 federal funds have been distributed. And so in terms of reimbursement, once a plan is received by our office, normally it takes us between 2 to 3 business days to be able to review the submissions, make sure they've met all of the required elements, and then move it towards our partners in financial operations for review of budget and final approval. Once that approval is made, then the award is activated, allowing our LEAs the opportunity to be able to submit for reimbursement as immediately as possible once their plan is approved. So as I've highlighted, our June 15th is really our target date that we've spoken to our LEAs about being able to release these documents so that they can get moving. We have put out a tentative application due date of August 20th, 2021. That is something where we're still seeking feedback in the public comment arena in terms of if that timeline is manageable or if there's additional time needed. Our initial reasoning for the August 20th, 2021 was again to make sure LEAs had access to their awards as soon as possible. Last but not least, before we kind of get into the question and answer section, just as a reminder to highlight where the ESSER funds are distributed across the state, we do provide 90% of them as per the federal formula guideline direct to our LEAs. And that presents some additional then money available through the state reserve that also has those funding restrictions on it per the new guidelines for ARP. And then there's a 0.5% that's available for state administrative needs. So with that, I'm open to any questions, as well as Chief of Staff Stanley, who's here as well.
Thank you. Vice Chair Belknap.
Yes, thank you. Sarah, I have a couple of questions, Chair. Can you tell me the time frame for spending money for ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and APR ESSER? When does it have to be spent by?
Great question. So as far as ESSER 1 goes, those funds must be spent by September 30th, 2022. ESSER 2 must be spent by September 30th, 2023. And then ESSER or ARP ESSER must be spent by September 30th, 2024. I will note that those deadlines include the Tidings Amendment, which allows for that additional 12 months.
Thank you, Chair. One more question, please.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you.
Department of Education requiring specific terms or, and I hate to say curriculum, but that is kind of the direction they've been going. Do you see them pushing a certain ideology in order to meet that 20% or to get that approved? Or I just don't know. Are you seeing that movement? I guess is what I'm asking.
Vice Chair, if I may.
Please.
I had a question regarding the application form that the LEAs will be submitting in, and I I was just blown away as I read the application form that you've put.
Member Booth, our LEAs are definitely at the forefront of the considerations that we've had on the table and as part of our dialogue in going through this process. We're certainly aware that in addition to in addition to that, for this particular application, they are required to call out their local plans to be able to address the 20% requirement to spend on the accelerated learning or needs our students may have experienced due to COVID-19. As a part of that, we do ask them to call out their evidence-based practice because that is a requirement as well, and then help us understand what their measure will be related to each of those items. In addition to then some narrative questions about that particular 20% section, they have another section that speaks to what they'll do with the remainder of the funds, the 80% or less that may be spent on areas outside of that accelerated learning. And then there is a section that's specific to the policies that are related to an LEA in terms of implementing face-to-face instruction. So we noted that our Utah schools are in a very different space than many other schools across the nation. So to help them, we actually pre-populated some of those boxes with sample responses that they may consider. Ultimately, they can make that decision about whether that's appropriate for their LEA, but we tried to make it meet the federal requirement while making it as effortless as possible. Aside from that, we just then ask for a set of assurances that are specific to the program, and that really rolls out the complete application. So it's
spend that money prior to having some ideas brought to us. I know I've heard
grade literacy. In addition to that, if you go to them are brought to the school board for consideration and approval in these spaces. And we have that data analysis piece.
And the summer programs are going to be available on websites so parents and others can view exactly what these curriculums are in these programs, just because it's not uncommon for some programs after school to weave outside of the educational requirements. And so anyways, I'm just wanting to make sure that there's a transparency for parents and community members to know exactly what the curriculum or whatever's being taught in those particular programs is being addressed. So
promote that opportunity and access. As far as the state programs go, that's actually going to be a competitive grant competition. And we do have a draft application that's being considered by
rather than in slides, just on one sheet and send that out to you. And that might be interesting for you, knowing that those advisory groups are pretty comprehensive.
I think that sounds great. Thank you for that. I've learned a lot today. Thank you. I'm not seeing it.
So I appreciate your service and willing to serve and your contributions. And so thank you for all those that participated today. It's important that we get this information, right? And thank you, Vice Chair Davis, for chairing. We spread those opportunities around and did an awesome job. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thanks to all of you for your participation today. And I don't know what you're going to do with your extra 30 minutes. Not like maybe we could do our employee evaluations that are due today. Hint, hint. Or maybe we need to extend those one more day since we've just spent the last several hours.
Was the email from you?
It was. It came out a week ago. I can send it again with that